The air is different tonight. You can feel it the moment you settle in, the way the darkness outside your window has a weight to it that ordinary nights do not carry. There is something about the hour between late and very late that peels back the ordinary surface of things, and for just a little while, you can sense what was there before the ordinary surface was laid down, before the roads, before the cities, before the written names. Stay with that feeling, because tonight we are going to follow it somewhere very few people have been willing to go. Close your eyes if you want to, or let them rest on the ceiling. Either way, let your body go heavy. Let the mattress take your weight. You do not have to do anything right now except listen and breathe, and let the words come in slowly, the way water comes in on a tide. Tonight we are going to Australia, not the Australia of the postcards, not the Australia of the red rock and the famous harbour and the reef you have seen in documentaries. We are going to a much older place, a place that was old when Egypt was young, a place that was already ancient when the first bricks were being laid in Mesopotamia. We are going to the Australia that existed before the world, as we understand it, had finished deciding what shape it wanted to take, and we are going to look very carefully at what was there. Because what was there, according to the evidence that keeps surfacing no matter how many times it gets filed away and forgotten, was not what we were taught. What was there was something that should not have been possible. A civilization so old that the word civilization barely covers it. A way of being organized, of reading the sky and the land, of passing knowledge across time and space, that lasted for tens of thousands of years without collapsing the way every other civilization we know about eventually collapsed. And then something happened. Something that the land itself still carries the memory of, if you know how to read the signs. The sea levels rose, the continent changed shape, and an entire way of life was not so much destroyed as submerged, buried, scattered, and quietly written out of the version of history that the modern world decided to keep. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? Let us start with something simple, something you can picture without any effort at all, a coastline. You are standing on a beach. Behind you, the land rises gently toward a plateau. In front of you, the ocean stretches to the horizon in a shade of blue that does not quite match any blue you have seen in other parts of the world. The sun is different here. It hits the water at a different angle, and the light that bounces back has a quality of age to it, as though the photons themselves have been traveling longer than photons elsewhere. Now imagine this coastline is not where it is today. Imagine that the ocean in front of you is dry land. Imagine that you could walk from where you are standing out across what is now water for 50 miles, maybe 100 miles, maybe more, and the whole time you would be walking on land, grassland, wetland, riverbed, dune. You would cross rivers that no longer have mouths because their mouths are underwater now. You would pass through valleys that are invisible to us, invisible on every map, because they are submerged under 100 meters of seawater. This is not a fantasy. This is what Australia looked like during the last ice age, when sea levels were somewhere between 100 and 130 meters lower than they are today. And what it means is that the Australia we know, the continent as it exists right now with its current shape and its current coastline, is not the Australia that the people who lived there for most of human history actually knew. The Australia they knew was bigger, significantly bigger. The landmass that geologists and archaeologists sometimes call Sahul, the ancient supercontinent that included what is now Australia together with Papua New Guinea and parts of what is now the seabed around them, was a different place. A place with different rivers, different lakes, different rainfall patterns, different ecosystems. And it was home, for a period of time, so long that it staggers the imagination, to people who built their lives not just on the land, but in relationship with the land in a way that no other human society before or since has managed to sustain for as long. We know people were in Australia at least 65,000 years ago, That is the number that keeps getting pushed back every time someone does a new excavation, every time a new dating technique gets refined, every time a new site gets properly analyzed. 65,000 years. For context, the earliest evidence of modern humans in Europe is around 45,000 years ago. The earliest evidence of human settlement in the Americas, depending on which sites you believe, is somewhere between 15 and 30,000 years ago. And those are the places that got most of the academic attention, most of the funding, most of the headlines. Australia had people 65,000 years ago, and possibly earlier, and those people did not simply sit still for 65 millennia waiting for someone to write their story down. They developed, they organized, they observed, they built systems. Not always systems that leave the kind of physical ruins that European archaeologists were trained to look for, but systems nonetheless. Systems of knowledge, systems of navigation, systems of land management, systems of astronomy, systems of law and governance that operated across enormous distances without any of the infrastructure that we normally associate with civilization. And the most extraordinary of these systems, the one that seems to most consistently short-circuit the assumptions we have been carrying about what early humans were capable of, is something that researchers have been slowly, carefully piecing together for several decades now, and that the Australian Aboriginal peoples themselves have never stopped carrying, even when the world around them did everything it could to take it away. It is a way of encoding everything you need to know about the world, not in stone, not in clay tablets, not in papyrus, not in any physical medium that can be lost or burned or flooded, but in song. The concept is usually referred to by outsiders as the song lines, though the people who carry them have many different names for the same underlying idea, depending on which of the hundreds of distinct language groups and nations they belong to. The dreaming tracks, the paths of the ancestor beings, the lines that connect every waterhole, every hill, every cave, every tree of significance across the entire continent, in a web of navigational and mythological information so dense and so precisely encoded that you could, if you knew enough of the right songs in the right order, walk from one end of Australia to the other without a map, without a compass, without any physical tool at all, and never be lost. Bruce Chatwin, the British writer who spent time in Australia in the 1980s and wrote about the songlines, in a book that became famous and also controversial in equal measure, described the experience of beginning to understand what the songlines actually were as one of the most disorienting intellectual experiences of his life. Not because the idea was complicated in the way that mathematics is complicated, but because it was the opposite of complicated. Because it was elegantly, breathtakingly simple, and because its simplicity made everything he had been taught about the hierarchy of human intelligence, about who was sophisticated and who was primitive, feel suddenly, completely wrong. The songs are maps. That is the simplest way to say it. Each song describes a path through the landscape, the features you will encounter, the waterholes where you can drink, the hills that serve as landmarks, the places that are sacred and require a certain kind of approach, the places that are dangerous and should be avoided during certain seasons or under certain conditions. The melody of the song corresponds to the geography. A rising melody means rising ground. A sequence of notes encodes a sequence of landmarks. If you know the song, you know the path, and you know it in a way that is nearly impossible to forget, because music encodes memory differently from any other medium humans have ever used. But the song lines are not just maps in the geographic sense, they are also libraries. They carry ecological knowledge, information about which plants flower when, which animals behave in which ways, at which times of year, which combinations of plant and animal presence indicate which types of soil or water or weather. They carry legal information, the protocols and boundaries that govern who has access to which land, who can marry whom, what responsibilities different people carry toward different parts of the country. They carry astronomical knowledge, the the positions and movements of stars and planets, encoded in myth in ways that allowed navigation both across land and, some researchers now believe, across open water. They carry, in other words, everything. Everything a complex society needs to function. Everything that in other civilizations got written down in books, or carved into stone or stored in libraries, was in Australia encoded in song and carried in the memory of living people for generation after generation after generation. This is an astonishing thing to sit with. It is also, if you think about it carefully, an extremely sophisticated solution to a very specific problem. The problem being, how do you preserve and transmit information across time in a landscape where writing materials do not naturally occur in abundance, where the practical demands of a mobile existence make the carrying of heavy physical objects difficult, and where the environment itself is subject to catastrophic periodic change that could destroy any physical archive? You encode it in the one medium that cannot be destroyed, the human voice, the human mind. The human memory, trained from early childhood to hold and transmit extraordinary quantities of encoded information in a form that is both beautiful and practical. The Australian continent, during the period of maximum human habitation, supported somewhere between 300 and 900 distinct language groups. That number varies depending on which linguist you talk to and how finely you draw the boundaries. But let us take the lower estimate. 300 distinct language groups, 300 different peoples, with different songs, different stories, different sacred sites, different areas of primary responsibility, and yet all of those peoples were in contact with each other, all of them participated in trade networks, all of them recognized each other's boundaries, all of them attended ceremonies that required long-distance travel, all of them maintained, across an entire continent, a level of social organization that is, by any reasonable measure, sophisticated. This is the thing that does not get said often enough. The common image of pre-contact Aboriginal Australia as a collection of small, isolated bands of hunter-gatherers, each group scratching out a marginal existence in a harsh and indifferent landscape, is wrong. It is not simply incomplete, it is actively, demonstrably wrong. And the evidence that contradicts it has been sitting in plain sight, in the oral traditions, in the archaeology, in the landscape itself, for as long as anyone has been paying attention. Now here is where the story gets complicated. Here is where we get into the territory that tends to make certain kinds of academics uncomfortable, and that tends to generate the kind of heated debate that suggests something important is at stake. Because the question is not just how sophisticated was the civilization that existed in Australia before European contact. The question is, how much did the world not want to know? In 1846, a German surveyor named Ludwig Leichhardt was exploring the interior of Queensland, in what is now northeastern Australia, when he came across something that he could not quite fit into the mental categories he had brought with him from Europe. He found in a region that he had been told was uninhabited or only sparsely populated by people living in the most basic possible conditions, evidence of careful, systematic land management. He found grasses that had clearly been cultivated. He found water management systems. He found signs that the land had been organized in ways that were not the product of accident or instinct, but of deliberate, sustained human effort. He wrote about it in his journal. But his journal also contained all the assumptions of his era about who was capable of civilization and who was not. And so his observations about the land management sat in uncomfortable tension with his assessments of the people who had done the managing. He could see what they had done. He could not quite allow himself to understand what it meant. This pattern repeated itself many times across the 19th century and well into the 20th. European explorers and settlers arrived in Australia carrying a set of ideas about human development that placed European civilization at the top of a hierarchy and arranged everyone else beneath it in descending order of supposed sophistication. Into this framework, the evidence of Aboriginal land management, astronomical knowledge, and long-distance trade networks did not fit. and what does not fit in a framework tends to get minimized, misinterpreted, or ignored. Let me give you a specific example, one that requires no interpretation, because the physical evidence is still there. In the Western District of Victoria, in the lava plains southwest of Melbourne, there is a place called Budj Bim. The Gunditjmara people have lived in this country for a very long time. How long is a matter that oral tradition and archaeology both address, and they address it in ways that are, in the most important respects, consistent with each other. The Gunditjmara built a system of channels, weirs, and holding ponds in the wetlands around Lake Condah that archaeologists, when they finally looked at it properly in the 1990s and 2000s, had to admit was one of the most sophisticated freshwater management systems ever constructed by any human society anywhere in the world at any time. The system was designed to trap and farm eels, specifically the short-finned eel, which is a species that migrates in predictable seasonal patterns and that, when properly managed, can sustain enormous quantities of dried smoked protein that can be traded across long distances. The Gunditjmara did not just catch eels, they farmed them. They built infrastructure to manage the water flows, the eel populations, and the harvesting cycles in ways that gave them a reliable, renewable food source that was not subject to the unpredictability of rainfall or the migration patterns of other animals. This means they were not hunter-gatherers in the sense that the word is usually used. They were aquaculturists. They were farming. Not in the way that European farmers farm, with seeds and ploughed fields and grain storage, but in the way that is appropriate to the specific ecological context of the Western District of Victoria, where the right move is not to plant wheat, but to manage water. The stone channels of Budj Bim are estimated to be at least 6,600 years old. That makes them older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. They predate Stonehenge. They were built when the pharaohs of Egypt had not yet been born, when the cities of Mesopotamia were just beginning to develop into something recognizable as urban centers, when the idea of writing as a technology was still centuries in the future. 6,600 years, and possibly older, because 6,600 years is the oldest date that archaeologists have been able to confirm from the materials they have tested. The oral traditions of the Gunditjmara speak of times and events that suggest the system is even older than the current confirmed date, which is consistent with the fact that the landscape itself was shaped by a volcanic eruption roughly 30,000 years ago, and the Gunditjmara oral tradition includes a detailed account of that eruption, an account that volcanologists who have studied it say is scientifically accurate in its description of the eruption's behavior, its effects on the landscape, and the long-term changes it produced in the local ecology. A 30,000-year-old oral account of a volcanic eruption, accurate enough that geologists can use it as a data point. Let that settle for a moment. This is not an isolated case. Across Australia, there is a pattern of oral traditions that encode geological events, astronomical phenomena, and ecological changes that science is only beginning to be able to verify. The story of the formation of Lake Eyre, the story of the separation of Tasmania from the mainland, the story of the flooding of the Bass Strait, the story of the inundation of vast coastal areas at the end of the last ice age. These stories exist. They have been collected, studied, and in many cases, verified as accurate descriptions of events that happened thousands and in some cases tens of thousands of years ago. Which raises an obvious question. How? How does a society with no writing, no physical archive, no institution in the Western sense of the word, preserve accurate information about a volcanic eruption that happened 30,000 years ago? About the flooding of a coastline that happened 12,000 years ago? About the behavior of a river delta that changed shape 8,000 years ago? The answer, which is both simple and profound, is very carefully, with a system specifically designed for the long-term preservation of information, with a social structure in which the holders of particular knowledge hold a responsibility and a status that is tied directly to the accuracy of what they carry, with a process of transmission that involves not just telling but doing, not just hearing but participating, not just learning but becoming, in some sense, the knowledge itself. This is, by any measure, an intellectual technology. It is different from writing. It is not less than writing. In some respects, given its demonstrated longevity, it is more. Now we need to talk about the sea. Because the civilization, the way of life, the organized, sophisticated system of human existence that we have been describing did not exist in the Australia we can see today. It existed in its fullest and most developed form in an Australia that no longer exists at all. At the peak of the last ice age, roughly 20 to 25,000 years ago, sea levels around the world were somewhere between 100 and 130 meters lower than they are today. The consequences of this for the Australian continent were profound and almost impossible to fully visualize without seeing it on a map. The continent itself was connected by dry land or by very shallow water, easily crossable by simple watercraft, to Papua New Guinea in the north. The Gulf of Carpentaria, which today is a large body of shallow water separating Queensland from the Northern Territory, was a dry plain. The Bass Strait, which today separates Tasmania from mainland Australia, was a land bridge. The Arafura Sea, which today separates Australia from Indonesia, was significantly narrower and in places dry. And around the entire coastline of the continent, stretching out in some places for hundreds of kilometers into what is now open ocean, there was land. Researchers have attempted to reconstruct what this land looked like. It would have included, along the northwestern coast, extensive riverine systems fed by rainfall from the monsoons that would have behaved very differently when the continent was larger and the ocean was further away. It would have included, along the southern coast, plains and valleys, and estuarine systems of enormous richness. The Lassipede Shelf, the Exmouth Plateau, the wide shallow platform south and west of Perth, all of this was land, inhabited land. Inhabited land that is now underwater. The flooding of this land did not happen all at once. Sea level rise at the end of the last ice age was not a single catastrophic event, though there were periods of faster rise, sometimes several meters in a century, fast enough to be perceptible within a human lifetime. The flooding happened in pulses over a period of roughly 10,000 years, from around 20,000 years ago to around 7,000 years ago, with the most dramatic rises occurring in several episodes, the most significant of which is sometimes called Meltwater Pulse 1A, which happened roughly 14,000 years ago and may have raised sea levels by as much as 20 meters in a matter of centuries. 20 meters in a matter of centuries. Think about what that means for a coastal population. A coastline you could walk to from your birthplace would, within your lifetime, or your children's lifetime, move inland. The beach where you collected shellfish would be underwater. The river mouth where you caught fish would be a bay. The low valley where your grandparents' grandparents built their shelters would be a cove. And the thing is, the people who lived through this, the people who experienced the flooding not as an ancient geological event but as a fact of their lived experience, remembered it. They encoded it in stories that have been collected and studied and that are, in their geography, their meteorology, and their emotional content, consistent with the actual process of sea level rise that the geological record documents. There are, collected and catalogued by Australian researchers, stories from at least 18 different coastal Aboriginal language groups that describe the flooding of a coastline. Not in the same story, not as a single shared narrative, but in stories specific to the particular piece of coast that each group's country bordered. Stories that describe specific geographic features that are now underwater. Stories that describe specific ecological changes. Stories that describe the emotional experience of watching land disappear into the sea. Some of these stories, when mapped against the bathymetric data, the data about the shape of the sea floor in coastal areas, match the geography of actual submerged features with a precision that is not easily explained as coincidence. The story describes a bay that formed when a headland was inundated. The seafloor data shows a headland in the right place. The story describes a spring of fresh water that used to emerge on what was then dry land. The seafloor data shows a geological formation consistent with a submarine spring in the right location. This is extraordinary, and it is uncomfortable, because if these stories are accurate descriptions of geographical features that are now underwater, it means the stories have been preserved accurately for a minimum of 8 to 10,000 years, and in some cases possibly much longer. And if stories can be preserved accurately for 8 to 10,000 years, it means that other things in those stories, the organizational systems, the laws, the responsibilities, the knowledge of the land and the sky, might also be very much older than anyone has been comfortable assuming. There is a man named Dwayne Hamaker who spent years at the intersection of Western astronomy and Indigenous Australian knowledge, working with Aboriginal elders and knowledge holders to document the astronomical traditions of various Australian language groups. His work, and the work of the researchers who collaborated with him, produced findings that most of the astronomical community did not initially know what to do with. Because what Hamaker and his colleagues documented was not a collection of simple myths about stars. What they documented was a system of astronomical knowledge, developed and refined over tens of thousands of years, that encoded information about stellar evolution, meteor impacts, the movement of planets, the behavior of variable stars, the nature of supernovae, and the use of stellar positions for navigation, calendar keeping, and ecological management. The Wardaman people of the Northern Territory, to take one example, have a body of astronomical knowledge that their elders describe as a complete system, a framework for understanding not just where things are in the sky, but what they mean and how they interact. Bill Yidumdu-Mahani, a Wardaman elder who worked with Hamaker and other researchers over many years, described the Wardaman star map in terms that suggest a level of systematic observation extending over a period far longer than the historical record of Western astronomy. The Yolngu people of Arnhem Land have navigational astronomical traditions that several researchers have compared favorably with the Polynesian star navigation systems that carried people across the Pacific, and that some researchers believe may predate and possibly have influenced the Polynesian traditions. The Burong people of northwestern Victoria identified and named the variable star Eta Carinae, a hypergiant star about 7,500 light-years from Earth that is one of the most luminous stars in the galaxy and that periodically brightens dramatically. The Burong noticed this variability and encoded it in their traditions, naming the star Kologoloric War. They noticed it, they tracked it, they encoded it in a tradition that survived to be documented by Western researchers. This is not superstition, this is observational astronomy. Long baseline, multi-generational, systematic observational astronomy. The kind that, in Europe, required observatories and instruments and written records. The kind that, in Australia, was accomplished by a system of oral transmission and cultural practice that maintained accuracy across time in ways that still, on reflection, seem barely possible. The Aranda people of Central Australia have traditions that describe geological events in specific detail. Oral traditions collected in the late 19th and early 20th centuries contain descriptions of landscape changes that geologists have subsequently dated to several thousand years ago. The traditions are specific enough in their geographic detail that researchers have been able to use them as guides to field sites. Now we need to go further back. We need to go back to the period before the flooding, to the Australia that existed when sea levels were at their lowest and the continent was at its largest, and to think carefully about what kind of society might have developed in that context. We know people were in Australia 65,000 years ago. We know the population grew over time. We know that by the time of European contact in the 17th and 18th centuries, the population of Australia was somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million, depending on which estimate you use. That is a broad range, and the uncertainty reflects the difficulty of estimating populations of non-urban, non-literate societies from historical evidence that is already compromised by the population collapse that began almost immediately upon European contact. But we also know that these populations were not randomly distributed. They were concentrated in the most ecologically productive areas, the coastal zones, the river systems, the wetlands, the areas where food was most reliably available. And the most productive of all those areas, the richest, the most biodiverse, the most suitable for dense human settlement, was the coastal zone, the coast, which is now mostly underwater. The implication is that the densest, most developed, most complex human societies in pre-contact Australia were living in the places that are now covered by the Timor Sea, the Arafura Sea, the Gulf of Carpentaria, the Bass Strait, the Great Australian Bight. They were living on land that we cannot directly excavate, cannot directly survey, cannot directly analyze with the tools of conventional archaeology. We know they were there. The oral traditions tell us. The logic of population geography tells us. The scattered evidence from inland sites that served as the less densely populated hinterland of coastal civilizations tells us. But the physical remains of whatever they built, whatever they organized, whatever monuments or structures or infrastructure they created in their most productive and most densely inhabited territories, is sitting on the seafloor under 100 meters of ocean. This is the great blank in the archaeological record of Australia, and it is a blank that has only recently begun to be addressed with anything like the seriousness it deserves. In the 1990s and into the 2000s, a small number of researchers began systematically looking at the continental shelf around Australia, using bathymetric data, sediment core analysis, and in some cases, actual underwater survey, to try to understand what the now submerged landscape of ancient Australia would have looked like. What they found was not surprising in its general outlines, because the geological evidence had always been there, but it was surprising in its specifics. The submerged continental shelf around Australia is not a featureless plain. It has valleys, it has river channels, it has what appear to be, in at least some locations, features that might be consistent with human activity, not definitive in most cases. Not the kind of thing you can point to and say with certainty, a human being made this, but suggestive, consistent, worthy of serious investigation. And then there is the Murujuga rock art. Murujuga is on the Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia, on the coast of the Indian Ocean just south of the Dampier Archipelago. It is one of the largest concentrations of rock art in the world. The engravings, tens of thousands of them, are cut into the distinctive dark red rocks of the peninsula, depicting animals, human figures, geometric shapes, and images that have not yet been fully interpreted. Among the animals depicted in the rock art are species that are now extinct in Australia. Thylacines, the Tasmanian tiger, which disappeared from the mainland at least 2,000 years ago and possibly much longer. Megafauna, the giant animals, enormous wombats, diprotodons the size of rhinoceroses, that went extinct in Australia somewhere between 45,000 and 30,000 years ago. If those depictions are representations of animals the artists had actually seen, not copied from older images but made from direct observation, then some of the rock art at Murujuga is at minimum 45,000 years old, and possibly older. Some of the engravings at Murujuga have been dated by indirect methods to over 30,000 years old. Some researchers believe the oldest engravings may be significantly older than that. If the oldest Murujuga art is as old as some researchers believe, it represents the oldest continuous artistic tradition on Earth, not just in Australia, on Earth. A tradition of making images in stone that has continued at the same site through the peak of the last ice age, through the post-glacial warming, through the flooding of the coastline, through the extinction of the megafauna, through 30,000 or more years of everything the continent could throw at the people who lived there. 30,000 years of continuous artistic practice at a single site. Let that settle for a moment. Now, The art at Murujuga is threatened. The petroglyphs, the engravings in the rock, are being damaged by the pollution from nearby industrial facilities. A significant number of engravings have already been irreparably altered. This is not a controversy in the abstract. This is happening now, and it is one of the most important conservation situations in the world, and it does not receive nearly the level of attention it deserves, possibly because the full significance of what is being lost has not yet been absorbed by the people making the decisions about industrial development in the region. But let us stay with the antiquity for a moment, because it matters for what we are building toward. If people were making sophisticated representational art at Murujuga 45,000 or more years ago, and those same people were organizing themselves across an entire continent using a system of encoded navigational and ecological knowledge, and those same people were engaging in long-distance trade and ceremony and social organization, then we need to update our mental model of what early Australians were capable of. And we need to ask, what did they build that we have not yet found? Across the continent, archaeologists have documented a pattern that has been there all along, but that has been consistently underemphasized in the mainstream account of Australian prehistory. It is a pattern of structures, arrangements, modifications of the landscape that represent in total an enormous investment of organized human labor. The stone arrangements are the most obvious example. Australia has hundreds of documented stone arrangements, carefully positioned rocks that form lines, circles, enclosures, and other geometric patterns. The best known is Wurdi Yuwang in Victoria, a large egg-shaped arrangement of basalt stones, about 50 meters long, that is oriented, with a precision that has been confirmed by multiple independent analyses, to the positions of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes. The arrangement has not been precisely dated, but the oral traditions of the Wathaurong people, on whose country it stands, indicate that it has been there for a very long time. Researchers who have compared the astronomical alignments with the precession of the Earth's axis, the gradual wobble that changes the apparent positions of celestial objects over thousands of years, have suggested that for the current alignments to be as precise as they are, the arrangement may have been constructed somewhere between 7,000 and 11,000 years ago. 7 to 11,000 years ago. Before Stonehenge, before the megaliths of Brittany, before the stone circles of the British Isles. And Wurdi Yuwang is not unique. It is simply the best documented, the most studied, the one that has received the most systematic analysis. There are hundreds of other stone arrangements across the continent, most of which have received very little scientific attention, because for most of the history of Australian archaeology, the question being asked was not what did they build, but rather what did they lack. This is the fundamental error that has distorted the entire field. The question of what Aboriginal Australians lacked, writing, metal tools, agriculture in the European sense, permanent architecture in the European sense, was the organizing question of 200 years of investigation, and it consistently produced the answer it was designed to produce: nothing. But if you change the question, if you ask instead, what did they have that we have not yet learned to recognize? The landscape begins to look completely different. They had water management systems, not just the Gunditj Mara eel traps of Buj Bim, but similar systems across the continent, in different ecological contexts, using different materials and different designs, but sharing the same underlying principle: intervene in the natural water flow in ways that increase the productivity of the landscape for human purposes. They had fire management, the practice of controlled burning, of deliberately setting fire to parts of the landscape in specific seasons according to specific patterns, to promote the growth of particular plants, to manage animal populations, to maintain the mosaic of different habitat types that supports the highest overall biodiversity and the most reliable food supply. This practice, now called cultural burning, is increasingly recognized by ecologists and land managers as the most effective tool available for managing the Australian landscape, and it was developed by Australian Aboriginal peoples over thousands of years and encoded in the songlines and the dreaming traditions and the seasonal ceremonial calendar in ways that were simultaneously culturally meaningful, ecologically precise. They had seed management. Researchers studying Aboriginal food practices in the desert regions of Central Australia have documented evidence that people were deliberately managing the areas around waterholes to promote the growth of seed-bearing grasses, selecting seeds for replanting, and in at least some documented cases, engaging in practices that shade into what we would normally call agriculture. Deliberate cultivation and selection of food plants. They had architectural traditions, not in the sense of permanent stone buildings, because in a mobile landscape managing civilization, permanent architecture in a fixed location is not always the most sensible solution. But they had sophisticated shelter construction in diverse regional styles. They had ceremonial structures, some of which are large and complex and have been documented by archaeologists. They had the fish traps and weirs and water channels that, as we have discussed, required organized collective labor and engineering knowledge to construct and maintain. And they had something that Western civilization is only beginning to understand the value of: a deep, detailed, precise knowledge of the particular piece of the Earth's surface they inhabited, built up over tens of thousands of years of continuous observation and encoded in a form designed specifically for perfect long-term preservation. This is not a romantic idealization. This is a description, as accurate as current evidence allows, of what actually existed, of what people actually built and maintained and transmitted across time in the continent of Australia. Now we get to the part that is harder to talk about. The part that involves not just the question of what was there, but the question of what happened to it. Because in 1770, James Cook sailed along the eastern coast of Australia and landed at a place he called Botany Bay. And he made observations that were reported to the British government, and in 1788, a fleet of ships arrived carrying convicts and soldiers and administrators, and the world as the people of Australia knew it began to end. Not immediately, not all at once. The process of dispossession and destruction took over a century, and is, in some senses, still ongoing. But in terms of the civilization, in terms of the organized, complex, long-sustained system of human life we have been describing, the impact of European colonization was catastrophic in ways that the word catastrophic does not fully capture. Within decades of European contact, populations that had been stable for thousands of years collapsed, not because Aboriginal Australians were warlike or resistant in ways that made conflict inevitable, though there was resistance, enormous resistance, and extraordinary courage in that resistance, but primarily because of disease. The smallpox epidemic that swept through southeastern Australia in 1788 and 1789 killed by some estimates between 50 and 90% of the populations it reached. Influenza, measles, and other diseases followed. People who survived the immediate epidemics often found themselves isolated, cut off from the knowledge holders who had died, from the country that had been taken, from the ceremonies that required gathering in places now occupied by settlers. The social structure, the extraordinarily sophisticated system of relationships and responsibilities and knowledge transmission that was the skeleton of Aboriginal civilization, was attacked at every level. Children were taken from their families and placed in institutions where the speaking of their own languages was prohibited and punished. Ceremonies were banned. Movement across country was restricted. People were relocated away from their ancestral lands, away from the specific geography that their songlines described, away from the sacred sites that their knowledge system was organized around. This was not ignorance, or at least, it was not only ignorance. Some of the people making policy understood perfectly well that they were destroying a knowledge system. They understood it because the knowledge system was the thing that connected people to their country, and to destroy the connection was to make the country available for taking. What is remarkable, given this history, is how much survived, Because it did survive, not completely, not intact. There are knowledge systems that are gone now, languages that no living person speaks, songs whose meaning has been lost, ceremonies whose protocols have not been transmitted. The losses are real, and they are profound, and they are ongoing. But across the continent, in communities that fought to maintain their traditions through everything that was done to extinguish them, substantial portions of the system have survived. Elders who held knowledge under conditions of extraordinary difficulty. Young people who chose to learn what their elders could teach. Communities that rebuilt connections to country that had been deliberately severed. Language revival programs, recording projects, the slow, careful, incomplete but real work of preservation and reconstruction. And in the process of this work, in the process of documenting and analyzing what has survived, researchers and communities together have begun to piece together a picture of what the civilization actually was. Not what outsiders imagined it was, what it actually was. And the picture that is emerging is one that should change, fundamentally and permanently, how we think about the history of human civilization. Let us go back to the ocean, because the most important pieces of evidence, the ones that most directly support the idea that Australia was home to a civilization of extraordinary antiquity and sophistication, are the ones that are sitting under the water. In the 1990s, a researcher named Josephine Flood published a comprehensive analysis of Australian rock art that included a systematic attempt to date as many sites as possible using available methods. Her conclusion, which was careful and cautious, and based strictly on the evidence, was that Australian rock art extended back at least 25,000 years, and possibly much further, and that the cumulative body of Australian rock art represented one of the most significant cultural archives in human history. But there was a problem. The oldest art was not uniformly distributed across the continent. It was concentrated, significantly, in the coastal and near-coastal regions. The regions that had been, during the Ice Age, the most densely populated parts of the continent. The regions where, if the logic of population geography holds, the most complex social systems would have developed. The regions that were, by the time researchers began systematically studying them, no longer coastline but interior, because the coastline had moved. This is a pattern that you see in other parts of the world as well. The cave art of southern Europe, the extraordinary painted caves of France and Spain, is also concentrated in areas that were, during the last Ice Age, productive and relatively sheltered zones near the coast or near coastal rivers. The oldest art everywhere tends to be in the places that were most productive when sea levels were lower, and therefore most likely to have supported the most sophisticated human cultures. But Australia presents this pattern in its most extreme form, because the extent of the continental shelf that was exposed during the Ice Age is proportionally much greater for Australia than for most other continents. And because the gap between the Ice Age coast and the current coast is so large, so much of what we would need to examine to understand the oldest phases of Australian civilization is inaccessible by normal archaeological means. This is not a permanent limitation. Underwater archaeology is a real field. It has made significant discoveries in other parts of the world. Submerged prehistoric sites have been found and excavated in the Baltic Sea, in the Mediterranean, in the North Sea, in the Gulf of Mexico, in the waters around Florida, in the Indian Ocean. Some of these sites have produced evidence of organized human activity going back 10, 12, 15,000 years. No equivalent systematic program has been carried out on the Australian continental shelf. Not because it is technically impossible, not because there is no evidence to look for, but because the resources have not been allocated, the will has not been assembled, and the political and cultural context in which such a program would have to operate has not, until very recently, been remotely supportive of the idea that there was anything important down there. That is beginning to change. Slowly, and in the way that academic revolutions always happen slowly, with individual researchers pushing against institutional inertia, with communities advocating for recognition of their own histories, with the accumulation of evidence reaching a critical mass that begins to shift the consensus. But it is changing, and as it changes, the outline of what was actually there, in the Australia before the flooding, in the Australia of the Ice Age and the deep time before it, is becoming clearer. There is a concept that a number of Australian researchers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, have begun to use to describe the civilization we are talking about. It is not perfect, because no single concept can capture the full complexity of what existed. But it is useful. The concept is the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. Not the oldest culture, not the oldest people, not the oldest tradition, the oldest civilization. Using the word in its fullest sense to mean an organized, complex, self-sustaining system of human social life that has maintained its essential character and transmitted its essential knowledge across unbroken generations from its founding to its present. By that measure, and given what we now know about the antiquity of Australian Aboriginal culture, it is not an exaggeration to say that what existed in Australia before the flooding, what began taking shape 65,000 years ago and continued developing and evolving and adapting through ice ages and sea level changes and the extinction of the megafauna, was the oldest continuous civilization on Earth by a margin that is not even close. The second oldest in this framing might be the culture of the San people of southern Africa, whose genetic and cultural traditions extend back at least 30,000 years and possibly much further. The third oldest might be in India, where there is evidence of continuous human habitation and cultural development extending back over 50,000 years in some regions. But Australia holds the record. Australia holds it comfortably. This is not a political statement. It is not an argument for contemporary policy. It is simply an accurate account of what the evidence, taken as a whole, tells us about the history of human civilization on Earth. Now, a question that has been circling around everything we have discussed, a question that tends to make people uncomfortable, but that has to be addressed. Why does this matter? Why does it matter whether we call what existed in Australia a civilization? Why does it matter whether we recognize the antiquity of Aboriginal Australian knowledge systems? Why does it matter whether we acknowledge that the flooding of the continental shelf buried evidence of organized human life that we have not yet adequately investigated? It matters for several reasons. The first is practical. The ecological knowledge encoded in Australian Aboriginal traditions, the detailed, precise, long-tested knowledge of how specific Australian ecosystems work, which plants and animals interact with each other, and which land management practices produce which outcomes in which environmental conditions, is increasingly being recognized as essential knowledge for managing the Australian landscape in the context of climate change. The return of cultural burning practices in various parts of Australia has already demonstrated that this knowledge, applied carefully and in partnership with the communities that hold it, produces measurable improvements in land health, biodiversity, and fire risk management. This is a practical argument for taking the knowledge system seriously. The second is historical. The story of human civilization that most of the world has been told is incomplete in ways that are not trivial. It is a story that begins in Mesopotamia and Egypt and China, and that traces a line through Greece and Rome and medieval Europe to the modern world, and that treats everything outside that line as peripheral, as footnote, as context rather than content. That story is not wrong exactly, but it is radically incomplete, and its incompleteness has consequences. It shapes what we think is possible. It shapes what we think counts as achievement. It shapes who we think is capable of civilization. If we incorporate the full picture, if we include in our account of human civilization the 65,000-year-old continuous culture of Australia, the extraordinary sophistication of the songlines and the astronomical traditions and the land management systems, if we reckon honestly with what the flooding erased and what survived, the story of human civilization becomes much richer, much more various, Much more impressive. The third reason it matters is the oldest one. It is the reason stories have always mattered. It matters because it is true. We are going to take a moment now. The body needs time to process all of this. The information is dense, and the implications are large, and there is a kind of cognitive adjustment required when the frame through which you understand the world shifts. So let the body go heavy. Let the breath slow. Let the mind rest on the surface of what we have been discussing, without trying to press into it further right now. Just let it be there, the image of a civilization older than any writing, older than any stone temple, older than any city, persisting across ice ages and floods and extinctions, holding its knowledge in song and carrying it through time. The songlines did not just serve as maps and encyclopedias. They served, in a sense, as a kind of cultural immune system, a way of protecting the essential core of knowledge and social organization against the many things that could destroy it: flood, drought, conflict, disease, the simple passage of time. When you encode your knowledge in a form that requires thousands of people spread across an entire continent to maintain and transmit, you are doing something that no physical archive can do. You are distributing the knowledge so completely that there is no single point of failure. You cannot burn a library that is in every person's head. You cannot flood a record that is sung around campfires from the Kimberley to the Kosciuszko Ranges. You cannot erase a map that is encoded in the relationship between a melody and a piece of ground. This is not an accident. This is engineering. Cultural engineering, the deliberate design of a system for the long-term preservation and transmission of essential information in a form that is adapted to the specific conditions of the environment in which it must function. It is, in its way, as impressive as the Pyramid of Giza. More impressive, actually, by the measure that matters most. It worked. The Pyramid of Giza had to be maintained by a state that eventually collapsed. The songlines were maintained by communities that were under pressure for 200 years and still preserved substantial portions of what they carried. Let us talk about the sky. Because one of the things that becomes clear when you start seriously engaging with the astronomical traditions of Australian Aboriginal peoples is that they were not looking at the sky the way Western astronomy looks at the sky. They were looking at it differently, in a way that is not less sophisticated, but that involves a different set of questions. Western astronomy, from its roots in ancient Mesopotamia and Greece, has focused primarily on the bright objects, the stars, the planets, the moon, the sun, the things that stand out against the darkness, because they are luminous. It built its entire framework around those luminous points, cataloging them, measuring their positions, tracking their movements, and building mathematical models to predict and explain what it observed. Australian Aboriginal astronomy did all of that. There are documented traditions from numerous language groups that show systematic observation and cataloguing of stars and planets, precise knowledge of their rising and setting points, of their seasonal appearances and disappearances, of their relationships to each other and to events on the ground. This is real astronomy, careful and systematic and multi-generational. But Australian Aboriginal astronomy also did something that Western astronomy only began to do very recently. It paid attention to the dark. The dark patches in the Milky Way, the areas of the night sky where dust clouds and gas block the light of the stars behind them, creating shapes of darkness against the luminous river of the galaxy, have been incorporated into Aboriginal astronomical traditions in ways that Western astronomy had no framework for until the 20th century. The dark patches are seen as animals, as emus, as possums, as serpents, as the shapes of particular beings who have particular significance in the ceremonial and ecological calendar. This seems at first like mythology, except that what the dark patches actually are, as modern astronomy has established, is the densest concentrations of star-forming material in the galaxy, the places where the next generation of stars is being born, the places where the most dynamic processes in the Milky Way are occurring. The emu in the sky, the shape formed by the dark patches of the Milky Way that several Aboriginal traditions identify as an emu, appears at a particular position in relation to the horizon at a particular time of year. When the emu's neck is horizontal and the emu appears to be running, emus on the ground are laying eggs. When the emu appears to be sitting, emus on the ground are sitting on nests. This is a precise and accurate ecological clock, encoded in astronomical observation. The emu in the sky is a real-time indicator of emu reproductive behavior. And since emu eggs and the fat-rich yolks of emu eggs are an important food source for many Aboriginal communities, this astronomical tradition has direct, practical application. It tells you when to look for emu nests. This is not the most sophisticated application of astronomical knowledge in the Australian traditions. It is one of the most easily explained. The full depth of the astronomical knowledge, the way it intersects with the navigational songlines, with the ceremonial calendar, with the ecological management system, with the governance structure, is much more complex than any single example can convey. But the emu is a good starting point because it is clear and it is beautiful and it works. There is one more thing that needs to be said about the astronomy before we move on, and it is something that several researchers have raised carefully because the implications are significant and the evidence is still being assembled. Some of the astronomical observations encoded in Australian Aboriginal traditions appear to describe phenomena that cannot be explained as the result of naked-eye observation of the sky during historical times. They appear to encode information about objects, events, or configurations that would only have been visible, if they were visible at all, many thousands of years ago, before the last ice age, before the flooding. This is a tentative claim. It is being made carefully by careful people who understand that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but it is being made. And if it is correct, it suggests that some portions of the astronomical traditions currently practiced in Australia encode observations that were first made not hundreds but thousands of years ago and that were preserved intact through all the changes that intervened. 20,000 years of careful astronomy. 30,000 years, encoded in song, transmitted by living people from generation to generation without a single break in the chain. That would mean that when the first Western astronomers turned their telescopes to the southern sky and began documenting what they saw, there were people in Australia who had been watching those same stars for longer than the entirety of recorded history elsewhere on Earth. There is a site in Western Australia that I want to describe to you now. Not because it is the most spectacular site in Australia, or the most ancient, or the most significant in terms of the knowledge system, but because of what happened when researchers finally looked at it seriously. The site is called Marra Creek, and it is in the Darug country north of Sydney. There is a rock platform there with engravings, not paintings but engravings, designs cut into the rock surface. Among the designs, there are figures that researchers in the 1980s and 1990s identified as depicting cetaceans, whales, in configurations that suggested knowledge of whale behavior and migration patterns. Whales appear in the rock art of numerous sites along the Australian coast, which is not surprising because whales are large and visible and important. But the configurations at some of these sites, the way the animals are depicted in relation to each other and to other elements of the composition, suggest knowledge that goes beyond simply having seen whales from the shore. It suggests knowledge of whale reproductive behavior, of migration routes, of the relationship between whale movements and seasonal changes in ocean conditions. Knowledge that, in the context of a society with substantial watercraft capability, is consistent with systematic offshore observation. With people who were not merely watching whales from the beach, but were in some sense following them, engaging with them, knowing them in the way that a maritime society knows the large animals of its territory. Which brings us to a question that has been circling in the background of everything we have discussed. What were the boats like? Not the rafts or simple watercraft that could have carried the first people to Australia across the narrow water crossings that separated Sunderland from Sahul during periods of low sea level, Not those. Those may have been simple. They may have been more sophisticated than we assume, but they may not have been. The boats of the Ice Age and after. The boats of the coastal civilization that existed when the continental shelf was above water. What were they? We do not know with certainty. We cannot know, because boats made of organic materials do not survive tens of thousands of years in tropical and subtropical conditions. The wood rots, the bark decomposes, the plant fibers that might have been used for lashing and waterproofing disappear. But we can make inferences. The Torres Strait Islanders, the peoples of the islands between Australia and Papua New Guinea, we were documented by European observers in the 18th and 19th centuries as accomplished seafarers with sophisticated watercraft capable of long ocean passages. The Malay fishermen who traded with the people of the northern Australian coast made regular voyages of hundreds of kilometres across open water that required reliable navigation and seaworthy vessels. And the songlines, several researchers have argued, contain navigational information that is most useful, most complete, most precisely organised in ways that suggest navigational use at sea rather than purely on land. The stellar navigation traditions of the North Coast people, in particular, encode information about star rising and setting points that is more useful to a person navigating offshore than to a person navigating on land. This is speculative. It is careful speculation, grounded in evidence, but speculation. The physical evidence for offshore navigation in ancient Australia is, necessarily, almost non-existent, because the material culture of maritime peoples in the tropics does not preserve well. But the logic is consistent. A sophisticated continental culture, organized across an entire landmass using a system of navigational knowledge encoded in song, existing for tens of thousands of years in a period when the coastline was far richer and more extensive than it is today, would have had every incentive and, given the evidence for their cognitive sophistication, every ability to develop maritime navigation. And if they did, the implications extend far beyond the Australian continent. There is a genetic mystery sitting at the heart of the story of human migration, and it has been sitting there for several decades now, getting harder and harder to explain away. And it points, if you are willing to follow the evidence where it leads, towards something that challenges the model of human migration most of us learned about in school. The standard model, the one that was taught in textbooks for most of the 20th century, went like this. Modern humans evolved in Africa around 200,000 years ago. They spread through the Middle East into Europe and Asia. Eventually, somewhere between 15 and 30,000 years ago, they crossed into the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge from northeastern Asia. And they reached Australia somewhere around 40 to 50,000 years ago via island-hopping routes through Southeast Asia. Clean, simple, directional. Each wave of migration moving outward from the African heartland in a pattern that could be represented by arrows on a map. The problem is that the genetic evidence, which has accumulated over the past 3 decades in ways that the original model did not anticipate, does not cleanly match this simple picture. And in particular, it does not match it in ways that are relevant to what we are discussing tonight. In 2015, a team of researchers published a paper in the journal Science that analysed the genomes of Aboriginal Australians and Papuan people and compared them with genomes from populations across Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. What they found was an unexpected genetic signal in certain South American populations, specifically certain populations in the Amazon basin, a signal that appeared to indicate some genetic contribution from a population related to Aboriginal Australians or Papuans. This was a striking finding. The conventional migration model has no mechanism for a biological connection between the Aboriginal Australians and the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, because there is no plausible route between Australia and the Amazon that does not require crossing the Pacific Ocean. Crossing the Pacific Ocean, in prehistoric times, before European contact, The standard response to this finding has been to note that it could have multiple explanations, that the signal is weak enough to be consistent with a common ancestral population that contributed to both groups without any direct contact between them, that more data would be needed to draw firm conclusions. All of that is true. Science is cautious for good reason. But the finding has not gone away. It has been replicated by subsequent studies using different methods and different datasets. And as the genetic databases have grown and the analytical methods have improved, the signal has remained weak, ambiguous, contested, but real. This is the kind of finding that, in a field with a different history, would be an invitation to serious investigation of the possibility of trans-Pacific contact in prehistory. In the field of Australian prehistory, which has a long and complicated history of dismissing evidence that challenges the standard model, it has been treated with considerable caution. But it aligns with something else, something that turns out to be a consistent thread through the indigenous traditions of several Pacific and South American peoples. The Mapuche people of southern Chile and Argentina have traditions that describe contact with seafaring peoples from across the ocean. The traditions are specific enough to include descriptions of the vessels and the appearance of the travelers that, to some researchers, sound more like accounts of Australian watercraft and Australian peoples than like any other candidate. The sweet potato, Ipomoea batatas, a plant domesticated in South America, was present in Polynesia before European contact. This is not disputed. It was carried there somehow. The most widely accepted explanation is Polynesian contact with South America, possibly through voyages that reached the coast of what is now Peru or Ecuador and returned with the plant. But some researchers have pointed out that the sweet potato distribution in the Pacific and the genetic analysis of the Pacific sweet potato varieties is consistent with multiple introduction events from multiple directions, including one that might have originated from a starting point in the Western Pacific rather than from South America. None of this constitutes proof of Australian contact with the Americas in prehistory, not individually. But the accumulation of suggestive signals, genetic, ethnographic, botanical, pointing in the same direction, is the kind of pattern that warrants serious investigation. And the reason it matters for our story tonight is this. If the coastal civilization of Ice Age Australia had developed maritime navigation, if the people of the extended continental shelf had the boats and the knowledge to navigate across open water, then the possibility of trans-Pacific contact in prehistory, not as a random accident of drift but as a systematic maritime activity, becomes not just possible but plausible. Australian Aboriginal navigational knowledge, specifically the stellar navigation knowledge documented in the traditions of the northern coast peoples, is sophisticated enough to support open ocean navigation. The knowledge of star rising and setting points, the knowledge of ocean current behavior, the knowledge of wind patterns and weather signs, that is encoded in these traditions, is not the knowledge of people who stayed close to the shore. There is a researcher named David Lewis, who spent years in the 1960s and 70s working with Pacific Islander navigators, learning their traditional navigation methods well enough to voyage with them on ocean-going canoes using only traditional techniques. He described the result of those voyages in a book called We, the Navigators, and his description of the precision and reliability of traditional Polynesian navigation became a foundational text in the serious academic study of pre-contact Pacific voyaging. Lewis also worked, later in his career, with Aboriginal navigators in Australia, and he documented in their traditions the same underlying framework of stellar and environmental navigation knowledge that he had found in the Polynesian traditions. The same attention to star rising and setting points, the same sensitivity to ocean swell patterns, the same integration of meteorological, biological, and astronomical observations into a unified navigational system. This does not prove that Australian seafarers reached the Americas, but it establishes that the navigational knowledge required to attempt such a voyage existed in Australia was sophisticated enough to work and is consistent with the traditions of other Pacific peoples whose descendants did make long transoceanic voyages. It is a gap in the story, a large gap, a gap that deserves to be taken seriously. Let your body go heavier now. The information is continuing to settle, finding its place in the mind, and the mind is doing what minds do when they are exposed to something large, which is to try to find a frame large enough to hold it. Give yourself permission to let the frame shift. The story of human civilization that most of us grew up with is a good story, but it is incomplete. It is like a map that shows some of the territory very well and leaves other large portions blank. The blank portions are not empty. They were never empty. They are just places where the map was not drawn. Australia is one of the largest blank portions on the map of human civilization. Not because nothing was there, but because the people who drew the standard map did not have the framework to see what was there, and because the people who could have told them had their ability to tell disrupted, for a century and more, by the very forces that made the standard map. But the blank is being filled in now, slowly, imperfectly, with all the friction and conflict and misunderstanding that characterizes any large shift in a field's understanding of itself. But it is being filled in, and what is emerging as the filling in proceeds is a picture of something that is genuinely astonishing, not in the way that things are astonishing because they are exotic or strange or beyond comprehension, but in the way that things are astonishing because they are true, and because when you hold the truth clearly in your mind, it is enormous and it is beautiful and it makes the world feel bigger than it did before. Let me tell you about fire. Not fire in the elemental sense. Fire as a technology. Fire as a tool of landscape management. Fire as one of the primary mechanisms by which the civilization of ancient Australia shaped its world and maintained itself across time. Australian Aboriginal fire management, usually called cultural burning or traditional burning, has been studied seriously for several decades now, and the picture that has emerged from that study is one that has changed the understanding of fire ecology in Australia in fundamental ways. The standard assumption, held by most European settlers and maintained in the scientific literature for over a century, was that fire in Australia was primarily a natural phenomenon driven by lightning strikes in dry conditions, and that Aboriginal burning, where it was acknowledged at all, was unsystematic and ecologically damaging, similar to the slash and burn agriculture practiced in some parts of the world. This assumption is wrong in almost every particular. Not just incomplete, not just oversimplified, but specifically and demonstrably wrong about both the nature of Aboriginal burning and its ecological effects. Aboriginal burning was systematic. It was organized according to a set of principles that took account of season, wind direction, soil moisture, fuel load, target species, and the specific objectives of the burn. Different burns at different times of year serve different purposes, reducing fuel loads before the high fire danger season, promoting the growth of specific food plants, maintaining habitat for specific animals, managing water flow in wetlands, communicating information across the landscape through smoke signals, and maintaining the mosaic of different aged vegetation types that provides the highest overall biodiversity. The evidence for this is multiple. Oral traditions describe in detail the burning protocols and their ecological rationale. Ecological studies have documented the changes in plant communities and animal populations that follow the cessation of traditional burning. Historical accounts from the earliest European observers describe a landscape that had clearly been managed by fire for a very long time, characterized by the open, park-like quality that is associated with regular moderate burning rather than the dense, fire-prone undergrowth that develops in the absence of burning. And the most striking evidence is what happened when traditional burning stopped. In the decades following European settlement, traditional burning was disrupted across most of the continent, partly because the people who practiced it were being dispossessed and relocated, and partly because European settlers, operating from their assumption that fire was damaging, actively discouraged it. The result was a rapid and dramatic change in the Australian landscape. Fuel loads built up, dense scrub replaced open woodland, the frequency and intensity of wildfire increased. The catastrophic fires that Australia has experienced in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, culminating in the Black Summer of 2019 and 2020, when over 18 million hectares burned and the smoke plume circled the globe, are in significant part a consequence of the removal of traditional burning from the Australian landscape. This is not a speculative claim. It is the conclusion of a substantial body of ecological and historical research, and it has been reflected in policy changes in some Australian states, which have begun working with Aboriginal land managers to reintroduce traditional burning on a limited basis. The results, so far, have been exactly what the tradition would predict: reduced fuel loads, improved habitat quality, increased biodiversity, and a landscape better equipped to manage natural fire events. This is knowledge that was developed over tens of thousands of years. It was encoded in the songlines and the dreaming traditions and the seasonal ceremonial calendar, not as abstract knowledge but as integrated knowledge, knowledge that you could not separate from the relationship between people and country, from the sense that you have a responsibility to care for the land, and that caring for the land is a form of caring for yourself. This is the knowledge that was very nearly lost, that is still being partially lost, as elders who hold specific knowledge of specific country pass away before that knowledge can be fully recorded and transmitted. That is being fought for by communities across Australia, against the ongoing pressures of dispossession and cultural disruption that did not end in 1888, but continue in various forms to the present day. Now let us come back to the flooding. Because the flooding, the slow inundation of the Australian continental shelf over the 10,000 years that followed the last glacial maximum, is not just a geological event. It is, if the oral traditions that describe it are any guide, one of the most traumatic and far-reaching catastrophes in human history. And it is a catastrophe that has been almost entirely invisible to the rest of the world, because the people who lived through it and whose traditions encode its memory were not, until very recently, considered by the dominant intellectual tradition to be people whose memories were worth taking seriously. Think about what the flooding meant, not abstractly, specifically. The richest, most productive, most densely populated parts of the continent, the coastal zones where rivers emptied into sheltered bays, where marine resources and terrestrial resources met, where the climate was moderated by the proximity of the ocean, were being inundated. Slowly, over generations, the land was being taken. The people who lived there had two choices. They could move inland, onto the less productive land of the interior that was already, in many places, occupied by other groups with their own relationships to the country. Or they could develop watercraft and other technologies that would allow them to maintain their relationship with the coastal resources, even as those resources migrated seaward. The evidence suggests they did both. The inland populations of Australia show, in the archaeological record, increases in density and in the complexity of food processing and storage techniques that are consistent with increased population pressure during the period of sea level rise. And the coastal populations, the ones who are the likely ancestors of the people who carry the most detailed oral traditions about the flooding, appear to have maintained a relationship with the sea as the sea expanded, developing maritime technologies that are consistent with an adaptive response to losing land. What they lost over those 10,000 years was not just territory. They lost the physical locations of specific sacred sites, sites that in the tradition were fundamental to specific songlines, to specific knowledge systems, to specific ceremonial responsibilities. Those sites are now underwater. The songlines that connected them to the landscape have, in many cases, been modified to accommodate the changed geography, to redirect around the inland edges of the old coastline rather than to the submerged sites themselves. This is an extraordinary act of cultural adaptation. To take a knowledge system that was organized around a specific geography and to modify it, preserving the essential structure and the encoded knowledge while accommodating the loss of the physical anchors that originally organized it, is a feat of intellectual engineering that deserves recognition as such. The people who did this, the people who maintained the continuity of the tradition through one of the most dramatic environmental changes in human history, were not passive victims of geological force. They were active, intelligent, creative agents who responded to an extraordinary challenge with an extraordinary adaptation. And the knowledge they preserved, the fragments of the pre-flooding civilization that survived in the traditions of their descendants, is still there, still being carried, still being passed on in the communities that fought for the right to continue carrying it. There are, in those traditions, things that are only now being understood. Things that, when they are fully understood, will change the picture of human history in ways that are not incremental, but fundamental. One of those things is the nature of the trade networks that connected the continent before European contact. Because the picture that has emerged from the archaeological analysis of material culture from Aboriginal sites across Australia is one of trade networks of extraordinary extent and sophistication. Objects made in one part of the continent have been found in archaeological sites thousands of kilometers away. Specific types of stone, specific shells, specific pigments move through the landscape in patterns that trace out the networks of relationship and exchange that connected different groups across the continent. The pearl shells of the Kimberley coast, for example, have been found in archaeological sites as far inland as 500 kilometers from the coast, and in directions that do not follow the most direct routes from coast to inland, but instead follow the routes suggested by the songlines, the ceremonial pathways that connected sacred sites across the landscape. This is not random trade. This is organized exchange, following established protocols, moving along established routes, governed by established relationships. It is, in other words, a continental scale economy, not a money economy in the Western sense, but an economy in the sense that matters, a systematic, organized exchange of goods and knowledge and services across a defined social and geographic territory. The routes of exchange, mapped from the distribution of traded materials in the archaeological record, correspond with a remarkable degree of precision to the routes of the songlines as they have been described in oral traditions. The paths that people traveled for ceremony, carrying and singing the songs that navigated the landscape, were the same paths along which goods moved. This makes perfect sense once you understand the social structure of the tradition. The ceremony was not separate from the exchange. The ceremony was the occasion for the exchange. The gathering that required long-distance travel was the gathering at which trade happened, at which information was shared, at which marriages were arranged, at which disputes were settled, at which the relationships between different groups were maintained and renewed. It was, in other words, a civilization, a distributed, non-urban, non-literate civilization organized around a knowledge system and a ceremonial calendar and a set of navigational routes, but a civilization in the fullest sense of the word. A complex, organized, self-sustaining system of human social life that maintained itself across an entire continent for 65,000 years. That is the thing we have lost sight of. That is the thing that has been so thoroughly buried under 2 centuries of dismissal and dispossession that even now, when the evidence is clear and the researchers are beginning to say it plainly, it still tends to land with a kind of surprise that it should not have. 65,000 years. One civilization, one set of knowledge, distributed across 300 languages and 900 distinct groups, maintained and transmitted by millions of people across one of the harshest and most variable environments on Earth. Nothing like it exists anywhere else in the world. It is the oldest thing humans have made, and it is still alive. Let me tell you about a man named Bill Niji. Bill Niji was an elder of the Gar Guju people of Kakadu in the Northern Territory of Australia. He was born somewhere around 1913, in a world that was already in the process of being transformed by forces that had no interest in preserving what he was born into. He died in 2002, having spent the last 2 decades of his life doing something that he understood as urgently necessary, trying to explain to people who had not been raised within the tradition what the tradition actually contained before it was too late. He was not the only one doing this. Across Australia, in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, as elders aged and as the awareness grew that certain things might not survive another generation without serious documentation efforts, a number of Aboriginal knowledge holders made the decision to share things that had previously been held within the tradition. Not everything. Not the things that are only for certain people to know. Not the sacred and the restricted, but enough to establish the framework, to give a sense of the scale and the depth and the character of the system. Niji's contributions were collected in a book published in 1989 titled Story About Feeling. It is one of the more unusual books in the literature of human knowledge. It is structured as a series of statements, many of them very short, that circle around a core insight that is expressed in many different ways across many different pages. The core insight is something like, everything is connected to everything, and the way you know that is not by thinking about it but by feeling it, and the feeling is not a metaphor but a fact about how the world actually works. This is not romanticism. This is not the kind of thing that sounds deep in a greeting card but has no actual content when you press on it. Niji was describing something specific, something that he understood in ways that went far beyond any philosophical tradition the Western reader would bring to the text. He was describing a relationship to the world that had been developed over 65,000 years of continuous engagement with a particular landscape. A relationship in which the distinction between the human and the non-human, between the observer and the observed, between the knower and the known, was understood to be a convention rather than a fact, a way of organizing experience that was useful for certain purposes but that did not correspond to the actual structure of the world. The actual structure of the world, as Niji described it, was one of connection and flow and responsiveness. The land is alive, not as a metaphor for the biodiversity of the landscape, though it is that too, but in the sense that the land and the sky and the water and the animals and the plants and the people are all part of a single system that responds to what you do in it, that has memory, that communicates. This is a description of an ecological system, and it is also a description of something that Western science is only beginning to have the conceptual tools to fully understand. The idea that complex systems have emergent properties, that the behavior of the whole cannot be fully predicted from the behavior of the parts, that feedback loops and nonlinear dynamics produce phenomena that look, from outside, like intention or memory or communication, is a fairly recent development in Western scientific thinking. It was the working assumption of Australian Aboriginal knowledge systems for thousands of years. The dreaming is often misunderstood as a creation myth, as the Australian equivalent of Genesis, as a story about how the world was made. But this is a category error. The dreaming is not a story about the past. It is a description of the present. The ancestor beings who moved through the landscape and shaped it in the dreaming are not gone. They are the landscape. The hill is not the place where the ancestor went to sleep. The hill is the ancestor, in a form that persists. This is an ontological position, a statement about the nature of being and the nature of what exists, that is different from both the Abrahamic religious tradition that most Western people were raised in and the materialist scientific tradition that has largely displaced religious traditions in the contemporary Western intellectual world. It is not compatible with either of those traditions in its original form, but it is not incompatible with what ecology, evolutionary biology, and complexity science have discovered about the actual nature of the world that humans inhabit. The idea that the landscape carries the memory of the processes that shaped it, that the current state of any piece of country is the record of everything that has happened there, that the relationships between species in an ecosystem are so deeply entangled that each species is, in a real sense, a part of every other species, and of the system as a whole. These are ideas that Western science arrived at through a long process of empirical investigation and theoretical development. They were the working assumptions of Australian Aboriginal knowledge systems from the beginning. This is not a reason to romanticize those knowledge systems or to pretend that they had no limitations. Every system of knowledge has its particular strengths and its particular blind spots, and the Aboriginal knowledge systems were no different. But the nature of the strengths and the scale of the achievement deserve to be recognized honestly and completely. The scale of the achievement is this. For 65,000 years, possibly longer, a system of human knowledge and social organization maintained itself across an entire continent, adapted to every change that the environment threw at it, preserved its essential structure through catastrophic losses of territory and population, and continued to generate new knowledge and new insight by continuous engagement with the world. Nothing else in human history comes close to this. Let us come to the part of the story that is hardest to tell, the part that sits between the ancient and the recent, between the world as it was and the world as it became, the part that requires us to hold, simultaneously, the knowledge of what was lost and the knowledge of what survived. In 1788, when the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay, there were, by the best current estimates, somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million Aboriginal Australians. The range is wide because the population data is inherently uncertain, but the lower end of the range is considered conservative by most researchers. By the 1890s, 100 years after the arrival of the first fleet, the Aboriginal population had fallen to somewhere around 90,000. The scale of this collapse is difficult to comprehend. It is one of the most extreme demographic catastrophes in human history, comparable in percentage terms only to the worst episodes of the Columbian Exchange in the Americas. Disease was the primary mechanism, but it was not the only one. Violence, displacement, the disruption of food systems, the destruction of the social structures that maintained population health, all of these contributed. The deaths were not uniformly distributed. Some communities collapsed entirely within a few generations of contact. Others survived with larger portions of their populations intact, partly due to geographic isolation, partly due to the particularities of which disease strains they were exposed to and when. The knowledge held by the people who died was not, in most cases, fully recorded before they died. The songlines and the dreaming traditions and the astronomical and ecological knowledge they encoded died with the people who held them, in communities that had no warning and no opportunity to organize a systematic documentation effort. What survived did so because of the distributed nature of the system. Because some communities survived with their knowledge intact enough to continue transmitting it, because some individuals held enough of the framework that, even if they had lost specific details, they retained the capacity to maintain and eventually rebuild their traditions. Because the land itself, in which the knowledge was encoded as surely as it was encoded in the songs, continued to exist and to provide the physical context from which the knowledge could, in some measure, be reconstructed. The reconstruction is ongoing. It is partial. It is imperfect, but it is happening. Community language programs are reviving languages that had only a handful of speakers. Cultural programs are reintroducing young people to practices and traditions that their grandparents were forbidden from teaching them. Land management partnerships are returning traditional burning and other ecological knowledge to the landscape. Recording projects are capturing the stories and songs and environmental observations of elders who carry knowledge that will not survive another generation without documentation. This work is not separate from the story we have been telling tonight. It is the latest chapter of the same story. The story of a civilization that survived everything that was thrown at it and is still here, still breathing, still transmitting, still engaged in the 65,000-year project of being human in Australia. Now let us go deeper still, because everything we have discussed so far, the song lines, the astronomical traditions, the fire management, the trade networks, the water management systems, all of it is relatively well documented. It has been published in academic journals. It has been discussed in public forums. Parts of it have even made it into the popular science literature. What has not made it into most discussions of Australian prehistory, what tends to get handled with a kind of careful ambiguity that suggests discomfort rather than uncertainty, is a specific class of evidence. Evidence that points not just to the sophistication of the pre-contact Australian civilization, but to its interaction with other civilizations in ways that the standard model of prehistory has no clean place for. Let me describe the evidence carefully, without overstating it. In the Gulf of Carpentaria, on the northern coast of Australia, there are Yolngu traditions that describe the Macassans, the traders from Sulawesi in what is now Indonesia, who made regular voyages to the Australian coast before European contact, trading metal tools, cloth, glass, and other goods for sea cucumbers, turtle shells, and other marine products. This trade is well documented by both oral tradition and by the physical evidence of Macassan campsites that have been excavated along the northern coast. What is more interesting and more controversial is the question of how far back this contact goes. The Macassan trade that is clearly documented by European observers extends back to at least the 17th century, and the oral traditions suggest it goes much further than that. Some traditions describe the Macassans as having been coming for a very long time, in terms that suggest a relationship measured in generations rather than centuries. But the Macassans are not the only ones. There are traditions from various parts of the northern and western coast that describe contact with peoples other than the Macassans. Descriptions of boats that do not match Macassan designs. Descriptions of encounters with people whose appearance and customs are described in ways that do not fit the profile of any historically documented contact group. Some of these traditions have been collected and analyzed by researchers working in ethnography and oral history, and the picture that emerges, taken as a whole, is one that suggests a more extensive pre-contact connection between Australia and the wider world than the standard model acknowledges. The physical evidence is more difficult. There are, at various sites in northern Australia, objects that have been found in archaeological contexts that do not fit the standard picture. Metal objects in layers that predate the documented Macassan trade. Remains of cultivated plants in contexts that are difficult to explain without positing contact with agricultural societies. These findings have been contested, some of them quite vigorously, and the controversies are not fully resolved. But the pattern is there. A pattern of anomalies, each individually explicable, but collectively forming something that is harder to explain away. And here is the thing about anomalies. In a field that is operating with a model that fits most of the evidence, anomalies are either explained, absorbed into the model, or set aside as probably the result of contamination or error. This is normal science. It is how science is supposed to work. But when the anomalies accumulate, when they keep showing up in different places and from different methodological directions, when they cannot all be explained by the same mechanism, they stop being anomalies and start being data. They start being the evidence that the model needs to accommodate, even if accommodating it requires revising the model. Australian prehistory is at that point. The accumulation of evidence, from genetics, from oral tradition, from archaeology, from ecological science, from astronomy, is reaching the point where the old model, the model of isolated, primitive, static societies living unchanged from the Stone Age to European contact, cannot be maintained. It is not consistent with the evidence. The new model is not fully formed yet. It is being assembled from many different fields, by many different researchers, in many different conversations that are only beginning to find each other. But its outlines are becoming clear. Australia was home, from the earliest period of human presence, to a civilization, in the fullest sense of the word. A civilization that developed over tens of thousands of years, a set of intellectual technologies for encoding and transmitting knowledge, for managing land and water, for navigating across the continent and possibly across the ocean, for maintaining complex social organization across vast distances without permanent urban centers that represented genuine human achievement at the highest level. That civilization was not frozen in time. It changed and developed and adapted across its 65,000-year history. It responded to the most dramatic environmental changes in human experience, the peak of the last ice age, the flooding of the coastal margins, the extinction of the megafauna, and it survived all of them. It developed new technologies and new strategies as the conditions demanded. And then, in the 1700s and 1800s, it encountered something it had not encountered before. A force that was not interested in adaptation, not interested in exchange, not interested in the knowledge the civilization held, but interested only in the territory. A force that did not see the land as already occupied by people with a 65,000-year relationship to it, but saw it as empty or as close to empty as made no difference. The encounter was catastrophic. We have acknowledged that. The losses were real and they were enormous and they continue. But the civilization is not gone. It is diminished, damaged, fractured in ways that will take generations more to heal. But it is not gone. The elders are still teaching. The young people are still learning. The ceremonies are still being held. The song lines are still being walked. The land is still being listened to. And the knowledge that survived, the knowledge that was protected through everything that was done to destroy it, is increasingly being recognized as exactly what it has always been. One of the greatest intellectual achievements in human history. You are lying here in the dark, listening to all of this, and maybe you are feeling the thing that I hope you are feeling, which is not sadness exactly, though there is sadness in this story, and not inspiration exactly, though there is that too, but something larger. A sense of the scale of human time. A sense of what is possible when people are committed to the long work, the work that extends across hundreds of generations, the work of maintaining a way of being in the world that is worth maintaining. Let your breath go slow. Let the room around you be the only room you need right now. Let the dark outside be the Australian dark. Enormous and old and full of stars that people have been naming and watching and singing for a very long time. Let us talk about ochre. Ochre is iron oxide, a mineral pigment that occurs in shades from yellow through orange to deep red, and it is one of the oldest materials in the human archaeological record anywhere in the world. Ochre has been found in archaeological sites dating back over 300,000 years in Africa, associated with early humans who appear to have been using it for body decoration, for hide preparation, and possibly for other purposes that we can only guess at. In Australia, ochre appears in the archaeological record very early, from the oldest sites that have been excavated. It appears not just in rock art, where its role as a pigment is obvious, but in burial sites, in living areas, and in contexts that suggest a range of uses that extended well beyond simple decoration. The ochre mines of Australia, the places where ochre was quarried for use in ceremony, art, and trade, are among the most significant archaeological sites on the continent. Some of them show evidence of use extending back tens of thousands of years. Some of them are sources of specific types of ochre that have been traced through geochemical analysis to archaeological sites hundreds of kilometres away. The Wilgie-Mia mine in Western Australia, a large underground excavation in the Murchison region, is estimated to have been in use for at least 30,000 years. It is one of the oldest known mining operations in the world. The ochre quarried there was traded extensively across the continent, reaching sites in other Australian states. But Wilgie-Mia is not simply a mine. It is a sacred site, maintained by the Wurundjeri people, whose traditions encode not just the practical knowledge of how to mine the ochre, but the ceremonial knowledge of what the ochre means, who has the right to access it, and what obligations come with that access. The mining of ochre, in other words, is not a purely economic activity. It is embedded in a social and ceremonial structure that governs who can mine, when, how much, and for what purpose. This integration of the practical and the ceremonial is characteristic of the entire tradition. There is no part of it that is purely economic, or purely spiritual, or purely practical. Every activity exists within a framework of relationships and obligations that gives it meaning beyond its immediate function. The ochre is not just pigment. The eel farm is not just a food production system. The fire management is not just agriculture. Each of these things is simultaneously practical and ceremonial, functional and meaningful, embedded in a web of obligation and relationship that makes the whole thing cohere as a civilization rather than a collection of survival techniques. This integration is one of the things that is most difficult to convey to a modern Western sensibility, which tends to separate the practical from the spiritual, the economic from the cultural, the scientific from the aesthetic. In the Aboriginal Australian tradition, these separations do not exist. Not because the tradition failed to develop the capacity for analytical distinction, but because the tradition, over tens of thousands of years of engagement with the world, arrived at the conclusion that the separations are artificial, that the world is not divided into the practical and the spiritual, the economic and the cultural, that these are dimensions of a single reality, and that a knowledge system that treats them as separate is missing something important about the nature of things. The ochre from Wilgimia, traded across thousands of kilometers, arriving at ceremonial sites throughout the continent, is not just a commodity, it is a connection. A physical link between distant communities, a carrier of the relationships encoded in the trade networks, a material expression of the web of obligations and shared knowledge that makes the continental civilization cohere. When you understand it that way, the ochre trade is not just an archaeological curiosity. It is one of the most ancient and most durable expressions of the civilization's organizing principle. That connection, maintained across distance and time, is the fundamental thing. There is a quality that the best traditional knowledge holders describe when they talk about what it feels like to be in proper relationship with the country. A feeling of being known. Not just of knowing the country, but of being known by it, recognized by it, held within it in a way that is different from the experience of moving through a landscape as a stranger or a visitor. This feeling is not mysticism divorced from the observable world. It is a description of a psychological state that arises from a particular and deep relationship to place. The state of having been formed in a place, of knowing its sounds and smells and seasonal changes and the behavior of its animals so completely that you are, in some meaningful sense, an expression of it. Every human being who has grown up in a single place long enough to know it deeply knows something of this feeling, but the Aboriginal tradition takes it to a depth and a formality that has no parallel elsewhere. You are not just formed by the country where you grew up. You carry specific obligations to specific parts of it that were laid down before you were born and that will continue after you die. Your identity, your relationships, your ceremonial role, your sense of yourself as a person in the world, all of it is bound up with a specific piece of country in ways that make separation from that country a form of destruction. The recovery of country, the return to land, is therefore not just political. It is a recovery of self and place. And so the people engaged in that recovery are doing something older than any other form of human social recovery. They are doing it tonight, right here in the oldest country on Earth. In 2013, researchers working in the Kimberley region of Western Australia documented something that had been in the oral traditions of the local people for as long as anyone could remember, but that had never been examined in the way it was examined. In that study, the study was about Wandjina figures. If you have seen the rock art of the Kimberley, you have probably seen the Wandjina. They are unmistakable. Large, round-headed figures with no mouths, with enormous circular eyes, with a kind of halo or headdress that radiates outward from the head. They are painted in red and white and black and yellow ochre on the rock faces of the Kimberley, in shelters and caves, and on exposed cliff faces. And they are, by any measure, among the most striking images in the entire world canon of rock art. The Ngunnawal, Warrara and Wunumbal peoples of the Kimberley are the primary custodians of the Wandjina tradition. For these peoples, the Wandjina are not historical figures. They are not beings who existed in the past and whose memory is preserved in the paintings. The Wandjina are present, active, powerful. The paintings are not representations of the Wandjina. They are the Wandjina and the ceremonial maintenance of the paintings. The careful repainting that is carried out periodically to keep the images fresh and the colors vivid is not an art conservation activity but a relationship maintenance activity. You repaint the Wandjina because the Wandjina are there and need to be cared for. The Wandjina are associated with rain and with cloud and with the sea. They came from the sea in many of the traditions, and they shaped the landscape and they put the law in place and they became the paintings. They are responsible for the rains, and the maintenance of the paintings is directly linked, in the ceremonial logic of the tradition, to the maintenance of the seasonal water cycle. This is the traditional context. Now for the thing that the 2013 research documented. Researchers systematically mapping the distribution of Wandjina sites found that the distribution is not random. The sites are organized in a pattern that is visible when you plot them on a topographic and hydrological map around the water systems of the Kimberley. Not the current water systems exactly, but something more complex. The distribution of the sites corresponds most closely to the water systems as they would have existed during a period of different climate conditions, specifically conditions that correspond to the early to middle Holocene, the period from roughly 10 to 6,000 years ago, when the Kimberley region was wetter than it is today. The implication, which the researchers stated carefully, is that the Wandjina tradition may have originated during a period of higher rainfall, and that the distribution of the sites may record the water geography of that earlier period. If that is the case, the tradition is at minimum 6,000 years old in its current geographic organization, and possibly significantly older. 6,000 years is not 65,000 years, but the principle it illustrates is important. The landscape of the Wandjina sites appears to be a record, a kind of map, of a landscape that no longer exists in exactly that form. The people who created and maintained the tradition were, consciously or not, preserving information about an earlier geography. This is the same pattern we have seen in the oral traditions about the flooding. The same principle. A tradition that looks like mythology, that appears on the surface to be a story about supernatural beings, turns out, when you look carefully at what it actually describes, to contain accurate information about the physical world that has been preserved across an extraordinary period of time. The mechanism is always the same, a truth encoded in a culturally significant form, a form that is maintained by practice, by ceremony, by the social weight of the tradition, a form that is specific enough to preserve the actual content rather than just the general feeling. And a time frame that, to Western ears, sounds impossible, because Western civilization does not have traditions this old. But the people who held them did not think it was impossible. It was not remarkable to them that they carried knowledge from 40 generations ago, or 400 generations ago, or 4,000 generations ago. It was what people did. It was what responsible people did. It was the most important thing you could do. And now let me tell you about something that sits in the gap between the evidence we have and the evidence we do not have, in the territory of hypothesis and careful reasoning, not speculation in the irresponsible sense, but thinking that follows the evidence to places it points without yet being able to confirm. There is, in the archaeology of Australia, a phenomenon that researchers call the intensification. It is the name given to a period, roughly from about 5,000 to about 1,000 years ago, during which the archaeological record in many parts of Australia shows a significant increase in the density of material culture, in the sophistication of food processing and storage technology, and in the scale and complexity of ceremonial activity. The intensification is visible in the archaeological record as an increase in the number of sites, an increase in the diversity of artifact types, evidence of new technologies being introduced or developed, and evidence of more elaborate ceremonial activity, including larger stone arrangements and more complex burial practices. Researchers have proposed several explanations for the intensification. Climate change. Population pressure following the stabilization of sea levels at roughly their current position. The development of new food processing technologies. Social and ceremonial innovation. What the intensification suggests, in its broad outlines, is that approximately 5,000 years ago, something changed in the way Australian Aboriginal societies organized themselves and managed their resources. Something changed that resulted in more complex social structures, more elaborate ceremonial life, more sophisticated technology, and higher population densities in the areas that show the clearest evidence of the change. What changed? This is where the evidence runs out and the reasoning begins. One hypothesis, which has been raised by several researchers and which has significant circumstantial support, is that the intensification was associated with the final stabilization of sea levels. The flooding of the continental shelf was essentially complete by about 7,000 years ago, and the coast had reached something close to its current position by about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. This means that for most of human history in Australia, the geography had been changing, and the social and knowledge systems had been adapting to a landscape in flux. When the landscape stopped changing, when the sea reached its current level and the coastline stabilized, the knowledge systems could optimize for a fixed geography in ways that were previously impossible. The songlines could be calibrated to a landscape that was going to persist. The sacred sites could be established in locations that would remain accessible. The ceremonial routes could be formalized and maintained with a precision that was harder when the routes themselves were changing. This is a hypothesis. It is consistent with the timing of the intensification. It is consistent with the nature of the changes that the intensification represents. It has not been definitively proven. But if it is correct, it suggests that the civilization we have been describing, as sophisticated as it clearly was even in its oldest recoverable form, became more sophisticated, more complex, more elaborately organized in the period after the flooding stopped. That the 65,000-year project of being human in Australia entered a new phase around 5,000 years ago, a phase characterized by the consolidation and formalization of knowledge systems that had previously been more fluid and adaptive. And it suggests that what European colonizers encountered in 1788 was not the original form of Australian civilization, but a relatively recent elaboration of it. A form that had developed over the previous 5,000 years in the context of a stable geography and that had reached, by the time of contact, a level of sophistication and organization that was genuinely exceptional. We do not know what the civilization of 5,000 years ago looked like in detail. We do not know what the civilization of 20,000 years ago looked like. We do not know what the civilization of the Ice Age coastal peoples of the extended continental shelf looked like, because the physical remains of their world are under 100 meters of ocean. But we know they were there. We know they were sophisticated. We know they had the cognitive capacity, because we know what their descendants were capable of, and the capacity did not appear from nowhere in the last 5,000 years. And increasingly, we know how to look for them. Not just with conventional archaeological methods, which are limited by what survives and where excavation is practical, but with the full range of methods that the convergence of different disciplines has made available. Remote sensing, sediment core analysis, genetic analysis, the systematic engagement with oral traditions as legitimate historical sources. The kind of cross-disciplinary collaboration that brings geologists and ecologists and linguists and astronomers and cultural anthropologists and community members together to work on the same questions. This is the direction the field is moving, slowly. against resistance that is as much institutional as intellectual, but moving. And what the field is finding as it moves in that direction is not a simple story. Not a story of a static primitive society replaced by a more advanced one. Not a story of isolation broken by contact. Not a story with a single arc from simple to complex or from backward to modern. It is a story of the oldest continuous project in human history. A story of people who figured out how to live on a continent for 65,000 years and counting. A story of knowledge so deep that it encodes the memory of volcanic eruptions and the flooding of coastlines and the extinction of giant animals. A story of a civilization that maintained itself through everything the world could throw at it, and that, right now, tonight, in communities across the Australian continent, is still being maintained. That is the story. That is the real story. Not the story of what was lost, though that is part of it. Not the story of what was taken, though that is part of it too. The story of what survived and what it means that it survived and what it says about what human beings are capable of when they commit to the long work. And now, the night is doing what nights do. The air has that particular quality that comes at the deepest part of the dark. The quality that is neither silent nor filled with sound, but balanced at the exact point between the two, and your body is somewhere close to the edge of sleep without being quite there, and the mind is moving more slowly now, through the images and the information we have been gathering together in this hour. Let the information settle the way silt settles in still water. Let it find its level. Let the parts that belong together find each other. The Wandjina looking out from the rock face of the Kimberley, the eel traps of Budj Bim gaming the wetlands of Victoria, the carved and engraved stones of Murujuga on the coast of Western Australia, the songline that runs from the Kimberley to the coast of Queensland, encoding 2,000 kilometres of navigational information in a sequence of songs that can be learned and carried in a single human mind. The stone arrangement at Wurdi Yuwang aligned to the positions of the solstice sun. The oral tradition of a volcanic eruption that happened 30,000 years ago, accurate enough for geologists to use as a data point. The stories of the flooding, specific in their geography, consistent with the seafloor bathymetry, preserved across 8 to 10,000 years by a system of transmission that should not work as well as it clearly does. These are not curiosities. They are not footnotes. They are not interesting examples of the things that primitive peoples sometimes manage to get right despite the limitations of their development. They are evidence of one of the most sustained and impressive intellectual enterprises in human history. Evidence of a civilization that took the long view in ways that no other civilization has managed to sustain, and that paid the price for taking the long view with 200 years of systematic destruction, and that is still here, still taking the long view, still maintaining the knowledge that was entrusted to it. There is something that happens when you stay with a story long enough. Something that does not happen in the first few minutes, when the information is still arriving and the mind is still assembling it into something it can manage. It happens later, after the novelty has settled and the immediate questions have found at least temporary answers, and what is left is not information exactly, but something more like texture, the feel of the thing, the sense of what kind of thing this is. The story we have been telling tonight has a particular texture. It is a texture of depth. Not the depth of mystery in the thriller sense, not the depth of the unknown and possibly threatening, but the depth of time. The depth of generation after generation after generation of people paying attention to the same piece of the world, adding to the accumulated attention of everyone who came before, building something that could only be built across timescales that no individual human life can encompass. This is the thing that is hardest to convey about what existed in Australia before the flooding, before the disruption, before the erasure that was attempted and only partially achieved. It is not primarily a story about sophistication in the technical sense, though the technical sophistication is real and impressive. It is a story about the long work, about what happens when a society decides that the most important thing it can do is maintain and transmit and refine and add to a body of knowledge and practice across an indefinite time horizon. Western civilization has struggled with this. Western civilization has produced extraordinary things in short periods of time, and it has a remarkable capacity for innovation and change. But it also has a tendency to lose what it made before, to forget what was known, to break the continuity that the long work requires. The Library of Alexandria, the knowledge of Roman concrete, the traditions of classical music that depended on oral transmission before notation, the folk medical knowledge that was displaced by institutional medicine and then lost when the institutions failed or the conditions changed. Western civilization is very good at innovation and very poor at the long work. The civilization of Australia was very good at the long work, perhaps better at the long work than any other human society in history, and the long work produced things that the fast work cannot produce. It produced knowledge of the landscape that was detailed and precise and integrated across a temporal scale that made it different in kind from the knowledge that can be accumulated in a few generations. It produced social and ceremonial structures that were tested and refined across thousands of years, and that, where they survived, still function in the ways they were designed to function. This is the thing that is worth sitting with, as the night moves toward morning and the body moves towards sleep. The idea of the long work, the idea that some of the most important things humans have ever done required not just intelligence and effort, but commitment across a time horizon that dwarfs any individual life. The people who first began the songlines did not know they were beginning something that would still be sung 65,000 years later. They were doing what made sense in their context, encoding useful information in a memorable and transmissible form. The people who maintained the songlines across the middle generations did not know how long the tradition had existed or how long it would continue. They were doing what their elders had taught them was important. The people who are maintaining the songlines now, in communities across Australia, do know the history. They know how old the tradition is. And they are doing something that has never been more difficult, in the sense that the forces arrayed against the long work have never been more powerful or more relentless, and has never been more important, in the sense that the knowledge the tradition carries has never been more relevant to the challenges the world is facing. The world is facing challenges that require exactly the kind of long-view thinking, the kind of relationship between human society and the natural systems that sustain it, that the Australian tradition was built to provide: climate change, biodiversity loss, the collapse of ecological systems that human societies depend on. These are not new problems, in the sense that they are new phenomena in the world. They are new problems in the sense that the modern world created them, and the modern world does not, on its own, have the intellectual resources to solve them. The intellectual resources exist. They exist in the knowledge systems of peoples who figured out how to maintain a relationship with a continent for 65,000 years without destroying it. They exist in the ecological knowledge encoded in the songlines, in the land management traditions, in the ceremonial calendar. They exist in the understanding of the world as a system to be maintained in relationship with, rather than a resource to be extracted from. These resources are not going to save the world by themselves. No single body of knowledge, however deep and however old, is sufficient to address challenges of the scale and complexity that we are facing. But they are part of the solution, and they have been left out of the conversation for too long, and the leaving out has had costs. The costs are not just environmental, though the environmental costs are significant and measurable. The costs are intellectual. When you leave a 65,000-year body of knowledge out of the conversation, when you treat the deepest and most sustained accumulation of ecological knowledge in human history as peripheral, as interesting but not serious, as culturally significant but not scientifically relevant, you impoverish the conversation in ways that have real consequences. The world is beginning to recognize this, slowly and imperfectly, as the world tends to recognize important things, but genuinely. The incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge into land management programs in Australia and elsewhere is not just a political gesture. It is the recognition that knowledge of 65,000 years standing deserves to be taken seriously on its merits, and that the merits are real. This recognition is one of the most important intellectual developments of the early 21st century. It is happening alongside the recognition of the antiquity and sophistication of other indigenous knowledge systems in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, and it represents a fundamental shift in how the world understands what knowledge is, where it comes from, and who is capable of producing it. The shift is incomplete. The resistance to it is significant. There are institutions and interests invested in the old picture, the picture that places Western scientific knowledge at the apex of human intellectual achievement and treats all other knowledge systems as inferior, primitive, superseded. That picture served certain purposes, and those purposes have not disappeared, and so the resistance to the new picture is not purely intellectual, but the evidence is what the evidence is. And the evidence, across many different fields and many different methodological approaches, consistently tells the same story. The story that we have been telling tonight. The story of a civilization old enough to have witnessed the formation of the Australian landscape in something like its current form, and to have been paying attention throughout. Now let the story settle. Let it become part of the texture of how you understand the world, the way that a piece of knowledge, when it is genuinely absorbed, becomes not something you know, but something you see through. The next time you hear about a forest fire in Australia, you will see it differently. You will see not just a disaster, but the consequence of the interruption of a fire management tradition that worked for 65,000 years. The next time you see a photograph of the Australian night sky, with the Milky Way arcing overhead, you will see not just a beautiful astronomical object, but a map that has been read and navigated and sung about for longer than any other astronomical tradition on Earth. The next time you read about the rising sea levels that climate change is producing, you will have a reference point. People in Australia lived through a sea level rise much more dramatic than anything currently projected, and they survived it, and they encoded the memory of it in traditions that are still being maintained. These are the things that the story of the oldest civilization on Earth makes visible when it is taken seriously, not as a curiosity, not as a symbol, but as an account of what actually happened and what it means for how we understand the capacity and the responsibility of human beings. We have been in the deep dark for a long time tonight, long enough for the body to have traveled far from where it started, in the sense that the thinking has taken us a long way, long enough for the night to have reached its deepest point. The breath is slower now. The body is heavier. The edges of the mind, the edges where thoughts start and stop, are beginning to blur in the way they blur when sleep is coming in, not rushing in. Coming in slowly, the way the tide comes in small advances that are barely perceptible individually, but that add up, over time, to something that covers the ground. Let it come. The song lines are still being sung. Somewhere in Australia, right now, someone is singing a song that their grandparents' grandparents' grandparents learned from their grandparents' grandparents. A song that describes a path through a landscape that has not changed in the ways that matter, that still has the hill in the right place, and the waterhole where the song says it will be, and the rock with the particular marking that tells you where to turn. Somewhere in Australia, someone is looking at the night sky and seeing not just stars, but a map, a calendar, an ecological guide, a system of navigation that was old when the first pyramids were being built. Somewhere in Australia, someone is preparing to burn a piece of country in the way that the season and the wind direction and the moisture content of the soil and the state of the vegetation all indicate it is ready to be burned, and that preparation is the latest iteration of a practice that has been making the Australian landscape more resilient and more productive for longer than any other human land management tradition in history. And somewhere in Australia, at the bottom of a sea that rose 10,000 years ago and covered the most important chapter of the civilization, the chapter we cannot read yet, the chapter whose physical evidence rests on the seafloor waiting for someone to come and look. That evidence is still there, still waiting. The oldest civilization on Earth left its records in song, in stone, in the landscape itself, and in the depths of the ocean that swallowed its first cities. We are still learning to read the parts we can reach. We have barely begun to consider how to reach the parts we cannot. That is the work that remains. That is the work that matters. And it is not a small work or a quick one. It is, inevitably, something close to the long work itself. Let yourself rest now. You have traveled a long way tonight, further than you might have expected when you settled in at the beginning, and the traveling has been worthwhile in the way that traveling always is when it takes you somewhere real. The night is doing what nights do, which is moving toward morning whether we are watching or not, and the body is doing what bodies do, which is finding its way to the place where it can let go of the day entirely and just be the thing that breathes and rests and rebuilds itself in the dark. The civilization was real. It was here. It is here. It survived the flooding and the fires and the extinctions and the 2 centuries of systematic destruction, and it is carrying its knowledge forward through the work of the communities that maintained it into a future that will need it. That knowledge is part of the world now, part of the record of what human beings have done with the time they have been given. And it is a record that, when you know it is there, makes the world look different. Bigger, older, more interesting, more full of things that deserve to be known. Let your eyes close, if they have not already. Let the darkness be comfortable. Let the sounds of the night, wherever you are, whatever night sounds are native to your particular place, be a kind of company. The night is old everywhere, but in Australia it is oldest. The stars above Australia have been named and watched and sung about longer than anywhere else. And the knowledge of those names, those watches, those songs, is still alive. Sleep well. Tomorrow the world will still be old and full of things we do not yet understand. And that is not a frightening thing. It is an invitation. The work continues. The songs continue. The civilization that was supposed to have been erased continues. And somewhere on the seafloor of the Australian continental shelf, in the darkness under 100 meters of ocean, the oldest chapter of the oldest civilization is waiting to be read. Good night. Wherever you are, whatever time it is there, thank you for being in this story with me tonight. The world is large and old, and still mostly unknown, and there is something right about spending the deepest part of the dark in that knowledge, something that makes the sleep that follows feel earned. Rest now. The song lines will be sung in the morning, the fires will be lit in the right season, the stars will be where they have always been, and someone will know their names. Sleep. There is a place in the Northern Territory where the rock surface of a long sandstone escarpment has been used as a canvas for tens of thousands of years. The Arnhem Land Plateau, a vast elevated massif of ancient sandstone that dominates the northwestern corner of the continent, is riddled with overhangs and caves and sheltered ledges that offered the people who lived there protection from the elements, and, it seems, an invitation to make images. The images at certain sites in Arnhem Land span the entire occupation of the continent. The oldest identifiable layers of imagery, identified by the superimposition of later images over earlier ones and by the subjects depicted, which include animals that have been extinct for tens of thousands of years, are from the earliest period of human presence in Australia. The most recent images, added within living memory by custodians, maintaining a tradition whose beginning they could not know, are separated from the oldest by a gulf of time greater than the entire documented history of Western civilization. At a site called Nawala Gabanmang, researchers working with the traditional custodians, the Jawoyn people, have documented paintings that date back at least 28,000 years. This is one of the oldest known painted sites in the world, comparable in antiquity to the painted caves of southern France and Spain that Western archaeology has celebrated for over a century. But Nuala Gabanmung differs from those European sites in one crucial respect. It is not an abandoned site. It is a site that has been continuously used, continuously maintained, and continuously added to by the Jawain people and their ancestors for 28,000 years. The French and Spanish painted caves have been empty for at least 10,000 years. The tradition they represent is extinct. The knowledge of who made them, why they made them, what the images mean, is gone. We have the images without the context. At Nuala Gabanmung and at many other Arnhem Land sites, the images exist within their context. The custodians know what the images mean. They know why they were made, what protocol governs their care, what knowledge they encode, what they communicate about the country and the law and the relationship between people and place. The context is still alive. This is the difference between a ruin and a living tradition, and it is a difference that matters enormously for what the art can tell us. A ruin speaks in a voice that has been cut off. A living tradition speaks in a voice that continues. And the things a living tradition can tell you about itself, when you have the humility and the patience to listen, are things that no amount of archaeological excavation can produce from a site that has been abandoned. The Jawoin elders and the researchers who worked with them at Nuala Gabanmung have documented a site that is not just a collection of images, but a record, a physical library of everything that has been important to the Jawoin and their predecessors across 28,000 years of continuous engagement with a particular piece of country, the animals, the people, the ceremony, the beings of the dreaming, the ecological changes, the astronomical observations. All of it is there, layer upon layer, in a palimpsest of human meaning that stretches back to a time when the world was still recognizably in the Ice Age. This is the thing that does not have an easy parallel in other parts of the world. The continuity, the unbroken thread from the deep past to the present. The sense that the tradition is not a museum piece or an archaeological curiosity, but a living, functioning, growing system that is still doing what it was always designed to do. And the more you understand about how the system was designed, the more extraordinary the design appears. Let us talk about law. Not law in the sense of legislation, the written codes produced by states and enforced by courts and police. Law in the older sense, the sense in which human societies organize themselves before writing, before states, before the entire institutional apparatus that modern governance depends on. In Aboriginal Australian tradition, the law, always capitalized in the way it is referred to in most accounts, is not a set of rules imposed by an authority. It is the underlying structure of the world. The obligations and prohibitions and protocols that govern how people should behave are not arbitrary human constructions. They are the way things actually are, the structure that was put in place by the ancestor beings in the dreaming, and that exists in the land itself as surely as it exists in the minds of the people who carry it. This is a very different relationship to law from the one most modern people are familiar with. In the modern Western legal tradition, law is made by humans, interpreted by humans, and enforced by humans. Its authority is conventional. We obey the law because we agree or are compelled to do so, not because the law reflects some deeper structure of the world. This is a pragmatically useful arrangement, but it has a weakness. Because the law is made by humans, it can be unmade or ignored or corrupted by humans, and the entire edifice depends on the continued willingness of enough people to participate in the convention. Aboriginal law is not susceptible to this particular weakness, because its authority does not derive from human consensus. It derives from the structure of the world itself, specifically from the structure of the country, the actual landscape in which people live. The sacred sites are not arbitrary designations. They are actual places in the actual landscape, places where the power of the ancestor beings is present and real and capable of being engaged with. The protocols that govern behavior at those sites are not arbitrary rules. They are the terms under which that power is available and not dangerous. This means that the law is self-enforcing in a way that human-made law cannot be. You do not need a police force to enforce the prohibition against entering a sacred site without the proper authorization and preparation, because the consequences of violating that prohibition are built into the nature of the site. People who have violated sacred sites in the recorded oral history of dozens of Aboriginal language groups have suffered consequences, not as punishments administered by human authority, but as natural consequences of the violation, in the way that touching a high-voltage wire has natural consequences. This may sound like superstition to a modern ear, but consider what it represents from a systems perspective. A governance system whose rules are embedded in the physical landscape, in sites that can be visited and experienced, and that have observable effects on those who interact with them inappropriately, is a governance system that does not depend on institutional enforcement. It is a governance system that is, in principle, as durable as the landscape itself. And given that the Australian landscape has persisted essentially unchanged in its fundamental character for millions of years, a governance system embedded in that landscape has a theoretical durability that no human institution can approach. This is not abstract. The law, as it has been practiced in Aboriginal Australia, governed the social organisation of hundreds of distinct language groups across an entire continent for tens of thousands of years. It governed marriage. It governed access to resources. It governed the resolution of disputes. It governed the relationships between groups, the protocols of encounter, the obligations of hospitality, the rites of passage across each other's country. It governed the transmission of knowledge, determining who could learn what, when, and from whom. It governed the ceremonial calendar, the timing and the form and the participation of the major gatherings that maintained the continental network of social relationships. All of this, governing the behavior of hundreds of thousands of people across a continent, without a state, without a police force, without a court system, without a prison, without any of the institutional apparatus that modern societies consider essential for governance. How did it work? Not perfectly. No system works perfectly, but well enough to maintain a functional social order across the entire continent for a period of time that no other governance system in human history has approached. The answer, in simplified form, is that it worked because it was embedded in the culture so deeply that the culture was the governance system. Not imposed on the culture from outside, not administered by a separate institutional structure, but constitutive of the culture itself. The way you raised children, the stories you told them, the ceremonies you brought them into, the relationships you established for them, the country you taught them to know and to care for, all of this was simultaneously the transmission of culture and the transmission of governance. You could not have one without the other. This is, in its way, the most sophisticated solution to the problem of governance that any human society has ever developed. Because the problem with governance, fundamentally, is compliance. How do you get people to follow the rules? The standard answer is coercion. You threaten punishment severe enough to deter violation. The problem with coercion is that it requires a coercive apparatus, which has its own dynamics and its own tendency toward corruption and failure. The Aboriginal Australian answer was to make the rules inseparable from the identity of the people who followed them. Not just to teach people the rules, but to make being the kind of person who follows the rules a fundamental part of who you are. Your identity, your relationships, your place in the world, your connection to country, your role in the ceremonies that sustain the world, all of it is bound up with the law in ways that make violating the law feel like violating yourself. This is not brainwashing, this is culture. All cultures do this to some degree. The distinction of the Aboriginal Australian system is the depth and the consistency with which it was accomplished, and the durability of the result. There is something else about the law that is rarely discussed in the popular accounts of Aboriginal Australian culture, and that is its extraordinary sophistication as an information management system. The law determines who has access to which knowledge, not in a simple hierarchical way, as though knowledge is arranged in a pyramid and you get access to higher levels as you rise in status. The structure is much more complex than that. Different people have access to different pieces of knowledge, not better or worse, but different. And the full picture emerges only from the combination of all the pieces. This is, in information theoretic terms, a distributed knowledge system with access controls. The total knowledge of the community is not held by any single individual or any single family or any single group. It is distributed across the entire community, with each person and each family holding their particular portion, and with the relationships between people and groups providing the pathways through which different portions of knowledge can be combined when the situation requires. The result is a system that is both redundant, because important knowledge is held by multiple people in overlapping ways, and resilient, because the failure of any individual or group to maintain their knowledge does not necessarily destroy the knowledge, because others hold related portions. And it is also because no individual or group holds all the knowledge, a system that is resistant to authoritarian capture. You cannot become a tyrant in a knowledge system where you literally do not have access to all the knowledge that governs the society. This is elegant. It is also, when you think about it from the perspective of a knowledge preservation system designed to survive long periods of time, exactly the right design choice. A system that concentrates knowledge in a single location or a small number of individuals is vulnerable to the loss of those individuals or that location. A system that distributes knowledge across an entire community is much more resilient. The flip side of this elegance is that the system requires the community to remain intact. If you remove individuals from their communities, if you destroy the networks of relationship through which the distributed knowledge system functions, you destroy the system itself, even if you leave many of the individual components alive. This is exactly what happened during the colonial period, when Aboriginal people were taken from their communities and placed in institutions, relocated to distant reserves, separated from their families and their country and the networks of relationship that gave the knowledge system its coherence. The destruction was systematic, whether or not it was always consciously intended as such, and the loss was enormous. But the distributed nature of the system meant that it was never, anywhere, completely destroyed. Fragments survived everywhere. The question of how those fragments can be reassembled into something that recovers more of the original system is one of the central projects of Aboriginal communities across Australia right now. And it is a project that requires both the knowledge that was preserved and the restoration of the relationships through which preserved knowledge can be reconnected and recombined. Let us come back, for a moment, to the question of the submerged coastline. Because there is a specific argument made by a number of researchers over the past 2 decades that the most important evidence for understanding the character of ancient Australian civilization is not on land at all, that the sites that would most clearly demonstrate the level of organization and sophistication of the pre-flooding civilization, if they could be found and excavated, are sitting on the continental shelf under the Timor Sea and the Arafura Sea, and the waters south and west of Perth. This argument rests on the same logic that applies to any coastal civilization. Coastal civilizations are dense, resource-rich, highly organized, and they leave the most concentrated physical evidence. They are also the first to be flooded when sea levels rise. The logic applied to Australia suggests that the most archaeologically productive sites, the sites most likely to contain evidence of permanent structures, organized living spaces, complex material culture, and all the other markers that conventional archaeology uses to identify civilization would have been in the coastal zones of the extended Ice Age continent. And those coastal zones are now under 100 meters of water. There have been a small number of surveys of parts of the Australian continental shelf. In 2010, researchers documented the remains of what appeared to be ancient river channels and lake beds on the continental shelf off the Pilbara coast in Western Australia. The features were documented using multi-beam sonar, and were consistent with a freshwater drainage system that would have been active when the shelf was dry land. Sediment cores from the area contained plant matter that dated to the period when the area was above sea level. This is important as a demonstration that the submerged landscape is not featureless, that it retains clear evidence of its terrestrial past, and that archaeological investigation of that landscape is technically feasible. It is not, by itself, evidence of human occupation of the sites documented, but it establishes the potential. The first systematic attempt to identify and document submerged cultural sites on the Australian continental shelf was only possible with the development of sufficiently detailed bathymetric data and sufficiently precise underwater survey capabilities. Both of those became available in the early 21st century, and the research program that has resulted is still in its early stages. What researchers are looking for is a specific signature in the bathymetric data, a combination of features that would be consistent with long-term human occupation of a particular area. Freshwater sources, which in a coastal environment typically means the heads of drainage systems where springs would emerge, sheltered locations, areas where the topography would have made sense for camping and for managing food resources, and, where conditions allow, the specific kinds of sediment layering that preserve artifacts in a way that makes them accessible to underwater excavation. The search is proceeding slowly. The continental shelf is enormous, and the available resources for systematic survey are limited. But in the areas where survey has been conducted, the results are consistent with the hypothesis that the submerged continental shelf contains sites of human occupation. In 2019, researchers working with the Nyangumata people of the Western Australian coast reported the discovery of 2 sites on the continental shelf that showed strong evidence of human activity. The sites were located using bathymetric mapping to identify features consistent with a freshwater spring on what would have been the edge of the ancient shoreline, and were subsequently investigated by divers who documented what appeared to be stone artifacts, including work stone and an arrangement of rocks that was not consistent with natural deposition. The results of this work are still being analyzed and the interpretations are still contested, as they should be with findings of this significance. The standard of evidence required for claims about underwater archaeological sites is appropriately high, because the opportunities for misidentification of natural features as human-made ones are significant in the underwater environment. But the principle of the search is established. The sites are there, the technology to find and investigate them is available or nearly so. The intellectual framework for taking the question seriously is being built. The collaboration between research institutions and Aboriginal communities that is necessary for this work to be done in the right way is being developed. And the oral traditions, the traditions that describe the flooding, the traditions that describe the country that was lost, the traditions that locate specific sacred sites in specific geographic features that are now underwater, these traditions are serving as guides for the search. They are telling the researchers where to look, in the way that oral traditions have been telling archaeologists where to look at important sites across Australia for decades. This is, perhaps, the most remarkable role that the oral traditions are playing in the current research program. They are functioning as the kind of archival records that conventional archaeology normally depends on, the written records that say, this is where important things happened, this is where you should look. But they are oral records that have been maintained for thousands of years, and they are specific enough in their geographic content to serve as genuine navigational aids for the search. When researchers describe the location of a specific submerged feature to elders of the relevant community, asking whether it corresponded to anything in the tradition, the elders not only recognized the feature, but provided additional information about it. Information about what had been there, who had been there, why it mattered, that was consistent with the bathymetric data in ways that were difficult to explain if the tradition had not preserved actual information about the actual place. This is the moment, in the story of Australian archaeology, when the two bodies of knowledge, the traditional and the scientific, are beginning to work together in ways that neither could accomplish alone. It is a moment that has been a long time coming, and that has required significant changes in how the scientific community understands its relationship to traditional knowledge, and in how Aboriginal communities understand what they are willing to share and under what conditions. The changes are real. The collaboration is imperfect and ongoing, and complicated by the history of what was done with Aboriginal knowledge when it was extracted without permission or respect in the colonial period. But it is happening. And what it is producing, the picture that is slowly emerging from the combination of oral tradition, underwater survey, terrestrial archaeology, genetics, astronomy, ecology, and all the other fields that are contributing to the rewriting of Australian prehistory, is something that the world has been missing. The full picture of what human civilization is, not the partial picture, the picture that begins with agriculture and cities and writing and treats everything before those developments as prehistory in the sense of something that does not quite count. The full picture, the picture that includes 65,000 years of continuous human achievement in Australia, that includes the songlines and the law and the fire management and the water management, and the astronomical traditions and the oral records of volcanic eruptions and the flooding and everything else that the civilization of the deep time of Australia contains. That picture is larger and more interesting and more useful than the partial picture. It includes more of what human beings are capable of. It encompasses a longer view of what the relationship between human societies and the natural systems they depend on can look like. And it provides, in the traditions that survive the disruption, resources that are directly relevant to the challenges that the world is facing right now. This is not a minor thing. It is one of the most important intellectual developments of our time. And it is happening in Australia, in a dialogue between communities that have been carrying these traditions for 65,000 years and researchers who are only beginning to understand what those traditions contain. The oldest civilization on Earth is teaching the newest civilization on Earth something about how to pay attention, something about what the long view looks like, something about what happens when you commit, truly commit, to the work of maintaining a relationship with the world that sustains you. There is a river in the Northern Territory called the Roper River. It flows eastward from the Arnhem Land Plateau through tropical savanna to empty into the Gulf of Carpentaria, and it has been flowing in roughly this direction for a very long time. The Roper is one of the rivers that was still running when the Gulf of Carpentaria was dry land, when the area now covered by shallow tropical sea was a flat, grassy plain crossed by rivers draining southward from the highlands of what is now Arnhem Land and northward from the heights that are now the Torres Strait Islands and the Cape York Peninsula. The people who know the Roper, the Manggarai and the Alawa and other peoples of the river system have been knowing it for as long as people have been in that part of the world. Their traditions about the Roper include not just the river as it is now, but the river as it was in different times, when the rainfall was different, when the vegetation was different, when the Gulf to the east was dry, and you could walk from the river mouth across what is now the sea floor to meet the peoples of the far shore. This is not mythology in the sense of invented narrative. It is geographic memory. The peoples of the Roper River system know, in their traditions, that the sea was not always where the sea is now. They know it not as an abstract fact about climate change or sea level rise, not in the scientific framework that Western knowledge has built to understand these phenomena, but as a specific and concrete piece of information about the history of their country. The country was bigger once, it extended further to the east. There were people on the land that is now the floor of the Gulf of Carpentaria, and those people had relationships with the river peoples, relationships that are still encoded in the ceremonial connections between the peoples of the Arnhem Land coast and those of Cape York, relationships that persist across the body of water that now separates them. The genetic evidence is consistent with this. The indigenous peoples of Arnhem Land and the peoples of Cape York share genetic signatures that suggest a period of more recent common ancestry than their current geographic separation would suggest. if that separation had existed for the entire period of human occupation of Australia. The most parsimonious explanation for the genetic data is that these communities were in contact across the land bridge that existed in the Gulf of Carpentaria during the last ice age, and that the flooding of the Gulf separated communities that had previously been in regular contact. The flooding did not, however, sever the relationship entirely. Ceremonial connections that clearly predate the flooding survived it, encoded in the songlines and in the ceremonial obligations that continue to bring peoples of distant parts of the continent together in ceremonial space. The flooding changed the geography of the relationship. It did not end it. This is one of the things that the songlines did that physical infrastructure could not. They maintained relationships across a landscape that was changing in ways that would have severed those relationships if they had depended on physical roots rather than encoded knowledge. The songline that connected two communities across a land bridge did not stop working when the land bridge flooded. It adapted. The path changed. The sacred sites that had been along the path were replaced by new sacred sites at the inland edges of the new coastline. The relationship between the communities was maintained through the ceremonial obligations that the songline encoded, even though the physical geography through which those obligations were discharged had changed. This is organizational resilience at a level that no institution we know of has matched. The ability of a social system to maintain its essential functions through a catastrophic change in the physical environment, not by retreating to a preserved space somewhere and waiting for conditions to return to normal, but by adapting in real time, modifying the physical expression of the system's organizing principles while preserving those principles intact. The organizing principles of the Australian tradition are the things that survived the flooding, the extinctions, the climate changes, the colonial disruption, not the specific protocols or the specific routes or the specific sites, though many of those survived too, but the underlying framework, the understanding that the land is alive and that people have responsibilities toward it, the understanding that knowledge is relational, distributed, and embedded in practice rather than stored in an archive. The understanding that the long view is always the right view. The understanding that ceremony, the structured practice of relationship with the world, is not optional but fundamental. These principles are as relevant now as they ever were. More relevant, arguably, because the world has spent several centuries acting as though they were wrong, and the consequences of that acting as though are now becoming impossible to ignore. Let me tell you about water. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. It is subject to the most extreme patterns of rainfall variability of any continent, with periods of severe drought alternating with periods of flood in patterns that are determined by large-scale climate systems, particularly the El Niño Southern Oscillation, that have been operating in roughly their current form for millions of years. Managing water in this environment is the central challenge of Australian land use. It was the central challenge for the Aboriginal peoples who developed the civilization we have been describing, and the solutions they developed are among the most technically impressive aspects of their achievement. We have already discussed the Gunditjmara eel farms of Bujbim, but Bujbim is not an isolated case. It is a particularly well-studied example of a pattern that appears across the continent wherever the specific conditions of the landscape and the specific needs of the local community created the opportunity and the incentive for systematic water management. In the desert regions of central and western Australia, where rainfall is scarce and unpredictable, the Aboriginal peoples who lived there developed an intimate knowledge of where water could be found, in what quantities, at what times of year, and under what conditions. This knowledge was encoded in the songlines in ways that made it precisely navigational. The songs described the locations of permanent water, seasonal water, and emergency water in a sequence that allowed a person who knew the songs to navigate across hundreds of kilometers of desert without dying of thirst. This is practical hydrology encoded in song. The songs are not just descriptions of the landscape in aesthetic terms. They are, among other things, hydrological maps, precise enough to be life or death reliable in one of the most arid environments on Earth. But the knowledge went beyond simple mapping of water sources. The Aboriginal peoples of the desert had developed techniques for locating water in places where it was not immediately obvious, for digging out buried water sources, for harvesting dew and morning moisture in ways that could meaningfully supplement the water available from surface sources. They had developed knowledge of which plants indicated the presence of groundwater and at what depth. They had developed knowledge of which geological formations were most likely to contain hidden water sources and how to access them. All of this was embedded in the song lines and the ecological knowledge traditions passed from generation to generation as part of the practical knowledge that every person needed to survive in the desert. Not as specialist knowledge held by a few experts, but as general knowledge held by everyone, because in the desert, everyone needed it. The capacity of Aboriginal peoples to survive and thrive in the Australian desert, which the early European explorers consistently found bewildering and often fatal, was not a matter of some genetic adaptation or some innate toughness. It was the result of 65,000 years of accumulated knowledge, carefully maintained and transmitted, about the specific conditions and specific resources of the specific environment they inhabited. Knowledge that made the apparently impossible routine. Burke and Wills, the European explorers who famously died of starvation and thirst in the interior of Australia in 1861, died in an area that was inhabited by Aboriginal peoples who had been living there successfully for thousands of years. Their deaths were not primarily a result of the harshness of the environment. They were a result of the absence of knowledge, of the specific, precise, locally particular knowledge that makes the Australian desert survivable. The knowledge was there. The Aboriginal peoples who held it were there and in fact offered help to Burke and Wills in the form of food, which the explorers, in a decision that beggars comprehension, declined. What the Burke and Wills expedition demonstrated in the most vivid possible way is that the Australian environment is not simply harsh. It is specifically demanding, in the sense that it requires a specific kind of knowledge to navigate successfully. General competence and good intentions are not sufficient. You need the specific knowledge of the specific country. And that specific knowledge of specific country, accumulated over 65,000 years and organized into a system of extraordinary precision and coherence, is exactly what the civilization of Australia developed and maintained. The knowledge is still there. It is damaged, incomplete in places, still being reconstructed in others, but it is there. And one of the most striking developments of the early 21st century is the degree to which that knowledge is being recognized by ecologists, by land managers, by climate scientists, by water managers, as not just interesting but useful, as containing practical information tested over tens of thousands of years in the specific conditions of the Australian environment that is directly relevant to the challenges of managing the Australian landscape in the 21st century. The return to country movement, in which Aboriginal communities are working to regain access to and responsibility for their traditional lands, is not just a political and cultural project. It is, increasingly, an ecological project as well. The return of traditional burning, of traditional water management practices, of traditional ecological management more broadly, is producing measurable improvements in land health, in the areas where it is being practiced. This is the proof, if proof were needed, that the knowledge is real, that it is not mythology or sentiment or the product of a romanticized view of the past. It is practical knowledge that works in the real world, that produces real and measurable ecological outcomes, that is as relevant to the 21st century Australian landscape as it was to the Australian landscape of 65,000 years ago, because the underlying ecological systems that the knowledge addresses have not fundamentally changed. The plants are different in some cases, some of the animals are different, the specific fire regimes are different in areas where the vegetation composition has changed, but the underlying principles of landscape ecology in Australia, the patterns of rainfall and drought, the dynamics of fire in the landscape, the relationships between vegetation types and animal populations, these have not changed in ways that make the traditional knowledge obsolete. They have changed in ways that require adaptation, the same kind of adaptive management that the tradition has always engaged in, but the fundamental framework remains valid. This is a remarkable thing. A body of knowledge developed 65,000 years ago for a landscape that has undergone significant changes in that time, remains valid as a guide to managing that landscape today. The longevity of the knowledge is a testament to the depth of understanding from which it emerged. An understanding so comprehensive and so well calibrated to the fundamental dynamics of the Australian environment that superficial changes in the specifics have not undermined its core validity. Let us go back to the very beginning now. Back to the moment, or the period of moments, when the first people arrived in Australia. When were they? The date of 65,000 years ago is the current best estimate based on the available evidence. But it is not a fixed number. It is a number that has been moving consistently in one direction, which is backward, as new sites are investigated and new dating methods are applied. In 1980, the widely accepted date for the first peopling of Australia was around 40,000 years ago. By 2000, it was around 50,000 years ago. By 2020, it was 65,000 years ago. And several researchers believe that when the submerged coastal sites are investigated, the date will be pushed back further still. How did they get there? Australia has been separated from the nearest landmass, the island chain that connects to Southeast Asia, by a stretch of open water for as long as there have been people to cross it. Even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, the crossing from the nearest point of Sunderland, the landmass that included what is now the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo, to the nearest point of Sahul, the landmass that included Australia and Papua New Guinea, required a sea crossing of at least 70 to 90 kilometers. 70 to 90 kilometers of open ocean, out of sight of land for at least part of the crossing, depending on weather conditions and the route taken. In watercraft adequate to carry not just one person but enough people to establish a viable founding population. This was not an accidental drift. This was a deliberate crossing, planned and executed by people who knew what they were doing, who had watercraft capable of the journey, and who were organized well enough to establish a permanent presence on the far shore. It was, arguably, the most significant voyage of discovery in human history, the first time that our species deliberately crossed open ocean to reach a new landmass. The people who made this crossing brought with them the knowledge systems, the social structures, and the intellectual capabilities that would eventually produce the civilization we have been describing. They were not starting from scratch. They were bringing with them everything that human intelligence had developed in the hundreds of thousands of years since our species emerged in Africa, and they were applying it to a new and extraordinary environment. What they found in Australia was a continent of extremes, the most variable rainfall patterns in the world, the oldest and most nutrient-poor soils on Earth, worn down by weathering over billions of years to a fraction of their original depth and richness. A fauna of extraordinary strangeness, shaped by the continent's long isolation, including giant marsupials, massive reptiles, and other megafauna that had evolved in the absence of human predators and had no behavioral defenses against them. And a landscape that, once the megafauna were gone and the climate had been fully integrated into the knowledge systems, would prove to be manageable and productive in ways that were not obvious to outsiders but were precisely understood by those who knew it. The relationship between the first Australians and the megafauna is one of the most debated topics in Australian prehistory, and we should address it directly. The megafauna of Australia included animals of extraordinary size and strangeness. Diprotodon optatum, sometimes called the giant wombat, was the size of a large rhinoceros and weighed up to 2,800 kilograms. Procoptodon golia, a giant short-faced kangaroo, stood over 2 meters tall and weighed around 250 kilograms. Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, was the largest carnivorous mammal in Australian history after the arrival of humans. There were giant monitor lizards, giant land tortoises, and a variety of other megafauna that made the continent's fauna, at the time of first human arrival, look unlike anything in the world today. Most of these species were gone within 10 to 20,000 years of human arrival. The debate about why they went extinct is substantive, with researchers divided between those who emphasize human hunting, overkill theory, and those who emphasize climate change, specifically the progressive aridification of Australia that occurred over the same period. The most current research suggests that the answer is both, and that the interaction between the two factors was more complex than either explanation alone can capture. Human hunting certainly contributed to the extinction of at least some species, particularly the large and slow-reproducing megafauna that were most vulnerable to a new predator. Climate change certainly stressed the ecosystems that supported the megafauna, reducing the availability of the food resources they depended on. And the modification of the landscape by human burning certainly changed the vegetation composition in ways that affected the viability of megafauna populations. What the research does not support is the dramatic version of the overkill hypothesis, in which the first Australians swept through the continent in a wave of ecological destruction, killing everything in their path. The pattern of extinctions is too complex, too geographically uneven, and too temporally extended to fit that simple narrative. What the research does support is a picture of human populations learning, through experience, how to manage their relationship with a novel environment and making mistakes along the way that had consequences. The megafauna extinctions were probably partly the result of those learning period mistakes. Hunting animals that had not evolved behavioral defenses against human predators, without yet understanding the ecological implications of removing them from the system. Over time, the people learned. They developed the law, the governance system embedded in the landscape that governed the relationships between human communities and the living world. They developed the knowledge of which species could be hunted and when, which species were protected and why, which areas needed to be left undisturbed and for how long. They developed, in other words, the ecological management system that maintained Australian biodiversity at near pristine levels for tens of thousands of years after the megafauna extinctions. This is, in itself, an extraordinary achievement. A society that learned from ecological overexploitation, developed a governance system that prevented its recurrence, and maintained that system for tens of thousands of years, is a society that solved one of the fundamental problems of civilization: how to sustain a human population indefinitely without destroying the ecological systems that sustain it. Western civilization has not solved this problem. We are still working on it. And the society that solved it 65,000 years ago, that maintained the solution through ice ages and floods and everything else the continent threw at it, is still here, still carrying the knowledge of how it was done. The night has moved deep now, deeper than it was when we started. The body has settled into the bed, and the mind has settled into that particular territory that is not quite waking and not quite sleep, where information seems to move in a different way, less processed and more immediate, less analysed and more felt. Let the story of Australia move through you in that way now, not as a sequence of facts to be remembered, but as a texture of the world to be absorbed, the vast antiquity of it, the deliberate, sustained, intentional nature of it, the extraordinary sophistication of the knowledge systems that maintained it, the catastrophe that came with European contact, the survival, partial and imperfect but real, of what was most important, the work of recovery and recognition that is ongoing. All of this is part of the story of what human beings are. It belongs in the account of what our species has done with the time it has been given. It is not a minor footnote or an interesting curiosity. It is one of the central chapters, perhaps the central chapter, of the story of human civilization. The oldest chapter. The one that started before all the others. The one that, against all the odds, is still being written. There is something that researchers in several fields have been independently arriving at, from different starting points and through different methodologies, that represents perhaps the most important intellectual development in the study of Australian prehistory in the past decade. It is a convergence, a point where lines of inquiry from genetics, from linguistics, from archaeology, from ecology, from astronomy, and from the oral traditions themselves all arrive at roughly the same place. The place they arrive at is this: the civilization that developed in Australia over 65,000 years was not just old, it was generative. It did not merely persist across time. It produced new knowledge, new ideas, new social forms, and possibly new peoples who carried its knowledge and its methods to other parts of the world. The genetic finding about the connection between some Amazon basin peoples and the populations of Australia and Papua New Guinea, which we discussed earlier, is part of this picture. But it is not the most striking part. The most striking part is the linguistic evidence. There is a linguistic phenomenon known as long-range comparison, the identification of similarities between languages that are so distantly related that the standard methods of historical linguistics, which work well for languages separated by a few thousand years of divergence, cannot establish the relationship with certainty. Long-range comparison is controversial in linguistics, as it should be, because the opportunities for coincidental similarity between languages with no historical connection are significant, and the field has been burned before by enthusiastic comparativists who found patterns that turned out to be artifacts of the methodology. But there is one long-range comparison that has survived scrutiny better than most, and it involves a connection between the Dravidian language family of southern India and the language families of Australia. The Dravidian family, which includes Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam among its major members, is spoken by several 100 million people in southern India and Sri Lanka. It is one of the major language families of the world, with a documented history extending back several thousand years and a clear genetic unity that is not seriously contested. The relationship between Dravidian and any other language family is much more controversial. For most of the history of linguistic research on Dravidian, the language family has been treated as an isolate, a family with no demonstrated connection to any other language family. Starting in the 1970s and continuing through the following decades, a small number of linguists began examining the structural features of Dravidian and comparing them with the structural features of Australian languages, specifically with the features shared across many different Australian language families, the features that are old enough to have been present in the ancestor language or languages from which the Australian diversity descended. What they found was a set of structural parallels that was too consistent and too specific to be easily dismissed as coincidence. Not vocabulary, because vocabulary is highly susceptible to borrowing and to coincidental similarity, but structural features. The organization of the grammatical system, the principles of how sentences are put together, the formal properties of the case systems that mark the grammatical roles of nouns, the features that are inherited from the deep ancestral language and that tend not to be borrowed because they are too embedded in the grammar to transfer easily between languages. This comparison is still contested. It is not the consensus view of historical linguistics that there is a genealogical relationship between Dravidian and Australian languages. The consensus view is that the evidence is insufficient to establish such a relationship, and that the parallels may be the result of typological similarity rather than common ancestry. But the comparison has not been refuted. It has been challenged, debated, refined, and the proponents have responded to the challenges in ways that have not resolved the controversy, but have kept it alive. And the possibility that it represents a genuine historical connection, a connection that would place the origins of the Dravidian language family somewhere in the territory of the ancient Australian or Sahul tradition, is one that is taken seriously by a minority of serious researchers. If the connection is real, the implications are significant. It would mean that the language tradition of ancient Australia is the ancestor not just of the hundreds of language families of modern Australia, but of one of the major language families of South Asia. It would mean that at some point, during the period when Sahul was a single landmass, and when sea levels were lower and the Indian Ocean coast of the extended continent was more accessible, there was a movement of population and language from the Australian tradition into India that eventually produced the Dravidian family. This is speculative, it is not established, but it is consistent with the genetic evidence, which also shows signals that connect ancient Australian populations with populations in South Asia in ways that the standard model of migration does not fully explain. And it is consistent with the ocean navigation hypothesis, the idea that the people of the ancient Australian coastal civilization had the capability to make sea voyages that extended beyond the shores of the continent. There is a separate line of evidence that points in the same direction. The traditions of several Aboriginal language groups in northern and northwestern Australia include stories about voyages, about contact with people from distant places, about relationships maintained across vast stretches of water. These traditions are not, in most cases, accounts of the Macassan trade, which is separately and specifically documented. They describe something older, something more foundational, something that the Macassan trade seems to be a latter-day continuation of, rather than an original establishment of. The traditions describe, in various ways, a time when the peoples of what is now the northern Australian coast were in regular contact with peoples across the sea to the north and west. A time when this contact was not occasional or accidental but systematic, the result of navigational knowledge and social relationships maintained across generations. If these traditions are taken seriously, as geographic memory in the way that the flooding traditions are increasingly taken seriously, they describe a period of transoceanic contact that predates all documented contact by a very long time. A period during which the maritime civilization of ancient Australia was not isolated on its continent, but was part of a broader world of connections extending across the Indian Ocean. This is the territory where the evidence runs out and the imagination has to take over. The territory where serious researchers distinguish themselves from enthusiasts by being willing to say, "This is as far as the evidence takes us, and the rest is hypothesis." The hypothesis is this: that the civilization of ancient Australia, in its fullest expression, during the period when the continental shelf was above water and the maritime capability of the coastal peoples was most fully developed, was not a sealed system. That it had connections, cultural and possibly genetic, with peoples and traditions across a wide area of the Indian Ocean and possibly the Pacific. That these connections contributed to the development of other traditions in South Asia and possibly elsewhere in ways that the modern world has not yet fully traced. This hypothesis would explain several things that are currently unexplained. The genetic signals connecting ancient Australian populations with South Asian and Amazonian populations. The linguistic parallels between Dravidian and Australian language structures. The traditions in several unconnected parts of the world of contact with seafarers from the south and east, the presence of certain cultural practices and technologies in widely separated populations that share no documented historical connection. It would not explain everything. No single hypothesis explains everything in a domain as complex as the prehistoric connections of human populations. But it would close some gaps, and the gaps it would close are significant ones. And it is consistent with what we know of the capability of the ancient Australian tradition. A society that developed over 65,000 years, a system of knowledge encoding and transmission sophisticated enough to maintain accurate information about volcanic eruptions and sea level changes across tens of thousands of years, a society with stellar navigation traditions sophisticated enough to navigate across the open ocean, a society organized across an entire continent using a web of ceremonial connections and trade relationships, is exactly the kind of society that might have been reaching out across the sea. The reaching out, if it happened, would have been one of the threads that connected the ancient world into something more like a network than a collection of isolated populations. A network through which knowledge traveled, through which populations occasionally mixed, through which the innovations of one tradition occasionally became the starting points of others. We know this network existed in the Pacific, where Polynesian navigation created connections across the largest ocean in the world in the first millennium of the Common Era. We know it existed in the Indian Ocean, where trade networks connected Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia for thousands of years before European contact. The question of whether the ancient Australian tradition was part of this network, or was itself one of its earlier nodes, is one that cannot yet be definitively answered, but it is a question that deserves to be asked. The body is heavy now. The night has done its work. The thinking has gone as far as thinking can go tonight, and what is left is the residue of all of it, the settled feeling of having been somewhere real, of having learned something true. The morning will come. The sun will rise over Australia as it has been rising for 4.5 billion years, and the people who have been watching it rise for 65,000 years will be in their countries, and the knowledge they carry will be there with them, in the songs and the ceremonies and the relationships and the land. That knowledge is one of the great achievements of the human species. Not a footnote, not a curiosity. One of the great achievements. Old enough to have witnessed the formation of the world as we know it, deep enough to encode the memory of catastrophes that happened before history began, sophisticated enough to maintain itself intact through conditions that would have destroyed any other system, and real enough, practical enough, true enough to the actual nature of the world to remain relevant after 65,000 years. The oldest civilization on Earth, still here, still singing. The mind is moving towards sleep now, not fighting it, not trying to hold on to the waking state any longer than the body allows. Moving towards sleep the way water moves toward the sea, following the grade, following the natural tendency of things to find their level. Find your level. The breath is slow, the body is still, the room is dark and quiet, and the night outside is whatever the night outside is in your particular part of the world. Maybe it is late. Maybe it is very late. Maybe you have been here for a long time, in this place between waking and dreaming, and the story has been the company you needed for this particular stretch of the dark. The ancient Australians spent their nights under the sky that was also a map, also a calendar, also a story, also a law. They watched the Milky Way wheel overhead and saw in its dark patches the shapes of animals whose behavior they could predict. They watched the stars rise and set along the horizon and knew, from that watching, exactly where they were on the face of the earth, and exactly what the season was, and exactly what the country required of them. They were never lost. Not in any landscape they knew the song for. They had, encoded in the tradition they carried, everything they needed to know about the world they inhabited, and they carried it carefully. And they transmitted it faithfully, and they maintained it across a span of time that makes all other human history look brief. This is what you carry with you from tonight. Not the specific dates, not the specific sites, not the specific details of the debate about the Dravidian connection or the genetic signal in the Amazon. Those are there if you want them. But what you carry is the knowledge of the scale of the thing, the sense of what 65,000 years actually means, the understanding that the oldest civilization on Earth was not a beginning but a continuation, not a primitive phase but a sophisticated achievement, not a lost world but a surviving one. The sleeping world is large and old and mostly unknown. You are a small part of it, lying in the dark in whatever part of the earth you call home, listening to a story about the oldest part of the human world. You will sleep soon, and the story will continue in you in ways that sleeping things do, processing and absorbing and incorporating, so that when you wake in the morning, you will carry something of what you learned tonight, not necessarily in your thinking but in your feeling, in the texture of how the world seems. Let the night finish its work. Let the sleep come all the way in. Let the ancient darkness of the Australian continent be the darkness you drift into, enormous and starred and old beyond any reckoning that makes comfortable sense, and full, on its vast floor, of the songs that map the country, and the fires that red the land, and the ceremonies that hold everything together across the longest span of human time that the earth has ever witnessed. Good night. The songs will still be there in the morning,